When war began in September 1939, Germany faced a structural reality. It could not defeat Britain on land without first isolating it by sea. Admiral Karl Dönitz calculated that roughly 300 operational submarines at sea simultaneously could sever Britain's supply arteries. Britain required close to 1 million tons of imported food, fuel, and raw materials every week to prevent industrial and civilian collapse. If that tonnage bled into the ocean faster than it could be replaced, Britain would stall. In the early years, German U-boats collided with merchant shipping in devastating sequences. In 1942 alone, submarines sank more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping. Off the American eastern seaboard, oil tankers burned within sight of shore. Convoys fractured under Wolfpack tactics that coordinated attacks via radio transmissions. Merchant crews faced casualty rates proportionally higher than many frontline combat units. A torpedo weighing over 3,000 pounds struck below the waterline and split steel plates designed only for cargo, not combat. Inside a U-boat hull, less than 300 feet long, sailors lived in cramped compartments with diesel fumes embedded in every surface. Batteries powered submerged movement. Diesel engines charged them on the surface. When depth charges detonated nearby, each explosive charge weighing hundreds of pounds, pressure waves rattled gauges and fractured light bulbs. Bolts groaned. Sweat formed despite cold Atlantic water outside the hull. Yet arithmetic hardened against Germany. American shipyards began launching Liberty ships in staggering numbers. Over 2,700 Liberty vessels were built during the war. Some were completed in less than 2 months, from keel laying to launch. Each ship carried thousands of tons of cargo: grain, fuel, ammunition, vehicles. Even in months when U-boats sank over 600,000 tons, Allied construction outpaced destruction. Convoy systems recalibrated. Instead of isolated merchant ships crossing alone, fleets of 40, 50, sometimes 70 vessels sailed together, screened by destroyers and corvettes. Escort carriers extended air cover into the mid-Atlantic Gap, an area once beyond range of land-based patrol aircraft. Long-range bombers, equipped with radar, scanned for periscopes and surfaced submarines. When I was examining sinkings recorded in German naval logs, alongside Allied production figures from 1943, one trend became undeniable. By mid-year, U-boat losses exceeded new construction and crew training capacity. In May 1943 alone, Germany lost over 40 submarines. Each U-boat required trained crews, specialized steel, precision-engineered engines. Replacement rates could not keep pace with attrition. Technological collision accelerated German decline. High-frequency direction finding triangulated U-boat radio signals. Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars projected contact-fused explosives ahead of escort ships, reducing guesswork inherent in depth charges. Improved sonar tightened detection ranges. Casualty rates among submarine crews climbed sharply. Patrol survival percentages eroded. The Atlantic itself amplified strain. Winter storms forced convoys into tighter formations. Ice accumulated on decks. Merchant sailors chipped frozen layers from railings to prevent capsizing. U-boat captains calculated attack angles in darkness, counting propeller beats to estimate convoy speed. A single error in depth setting caused torpedoes to pass beneath hulls or detonate prematurely. Germany also faced strategic limitation in surface fleet composition. Battleships such as Bismarck displaced over 40,000 tons and mounted guns firing shells weighing over 1,000 pounds. Yet, such vessels were few and vulnerable. After the sinking of Bismarck, Germany relied primarily on submarines for Atlantic interdiction. As Allied air coverage extended across nearly the entire ocean, surfaced submarines faced detection within hours. Radar mounted on aircraft could detect metal silhouettes against water, even at night. By 1944, U-boat operations increasingly stalled before contact. Patrol durations extended while sinkings declined. Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic not because its submariners lacked discipline or tactical skill. It lost because industrial output and technological adaptation outpaced its capacity to inflict sustainable tonnage losses. Allied shipbuilding replaced cargo faster than submarines could sink it. Anti-submarine warfare evolved in months, while U-boat innovation lagged under material constraint. Fuel shortages in the Reich limited training hours for new crews. The arithmetic that once favored Germany in the early years inverted. Where Britain once feared collapse under shipping losses, Germany faced unsustainable submarine casualties. Steel hulls fractured under depth charges. Crews were lost faster than they could be trained. Radio silence increased, but reduced coordination effectiveness. If you are listening now, perhaps letting the steady rhythm of this account settle you, imagine the Atlantic at night. Black water stretching beyond sight, engines humming below deck, sonar pings echoing through steel. For years, that ocean carried a hidden war measured in tonnage and survival percentages. Gradually, the sound shifted from hunter to hunted. Let that slow shift ease into quiet. In the chapters ahead, we will trace the early Wolfpack successes, the American Eastern Seaboard sinkings, the convoy recalibrations, the technological race, and the final erosion of German submarine power. This is the entire history of why Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Chapter 1. The Ribbon Clerk's Mistake. The 3rd of September 1939, and the war was 11 hours old. In a cramped office overlooking the gray chop of Wilhelmshaven Harbor, Captain Zur See Karl Dönitz sat at a wooden desk, reviewing a document that had been prepared 18 months earlier, a procurement estimate for submarine construction that carried the bureaucratic designation of Planning File BDU/Op24/38. The paper was thin, wartime stock, and someone had made a correction in pencil near the bottom of the second page, where the original typewritten text read, 300 operational boats required. A hand had crossed out the number, written maybe 90 in the margin, then erased it hard enough to leave a smudge. The eraser hadn't quite worked. You could still see the ghost of the question mark. Dönitz commanded 57 submarines. 22 of them were Type 2 coastal boats, stubby little things the crews called canoes, suitable for training exercises in the Baltic, but functionally useless for hunting convoys in the North Atlantic. That left 35 ocean-going boats to wage what the Kriegsmarine believed would be a decisive campaign against British shipping. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. In 1917, during the First World War, German U-boats had come within weeks of starving Britain into surrender by sinking 750,000 tons of merchant shipping every month. Dönitz had studied those numbers obsessively. He'd built his entire doctrine around them. To repeat that success, to force Britain's capitulation through tonnage starvation, he calculated that Germany would need to sink that same monthly total, 750,000 tons. When I was cross-referencing his pre-war memoranda with the actual operational readiness reports filed that first week of September, I found it striking that no one in the Oberkommando der Marine appears to have asked Dönitz to defend his arithmetic in writing. The formula was theoretically sound, but depended entirely on having enough boats at sea simultaneously to maintain continuous pressure on the convoy lanes. Each Type 7 submarine could remain on patrol for approximately 6 weeks, accounting for transit time to and from the hunting grounds. If you assumed optimistically that each boat could sink 2 merchant ships per patrol, roughly 14,000 tons total, then achieving 750,000 tons per month would require somewhere in the neighborhood of 53 successful attacks spread across the force. With only 35 operational boats, and accounting for the fact that at any given moment 1/3 would be in port for maintenance, 1/3 in transit, and 1/3 actually hunting, Dönitz had maybe 12 submarines on station at once. 12 boats. The math had never worked. The war began anyway. At 14 minutes past 9 on the evening of September 3rd, Oberleutnant Zur See Fritz Julius Lemp, commanding U-30, spotted a large passenger liner running without lights 250 miles northwest of Ireland. Lemp was 26 years old and had been at sea for exactly 3 days. The standing orders from Berlin were explicit. Submarines were to follow prize rules, meaning no attacks on passenger vessels, no attacks without warning, strict adherence to international law. But the ship was blacked out, sailing alone, zigzagging. It looked like a troop ship or an armed merchant cruiser trying to evade detection. Lemp fired 2 torpedoes. Both hit. The ship was the Athenia, a British liner carrying more than 1,000 passengers, including 300 Americans. She sank in 14 hours. 117 people died, among them 28 American citizens. The United States was still neutral, and now German submarines had killed American civilians on the first day of the war. When Lemp realized his mistake, probably within hours, certainly by the time he returned to port 2 weeks later, he falsified his war diary, omitting any mention of the attack. The official Kriegsmarine response was to deny involvement entirely and suggest that Winston Churchill had orchestrated the sinking himself as a propaganda stunt. It wasn't until after the war, during the Nuremberg trials, that the truth emerged from reconstructed crew testimony. Lemp had misidentified the target, panicked, and shot. The very first torpedo fired in the Battle of the Atlantic had been a catastrophic error that violated Germany's own operational guidelines and handed Britain a massive propaganda victory before the campaign had properly begun. By November of 1939, Dönitz was claiming in his reports to Berlin that his U-boats had sunk 110,000 tons of Allied shipping. The actual verified total, according to British Admiralty loss records, cross-referenced with Lloyd's of London registry data, was 53,000 tons. This discrepancy, the gap between claimed tonnages and actual losses, would persist throughout the entire war, a statistical mirage that made it nearly impossible for German planners to accurately assess whether the campaign was succeeding or failing. Part of the problem was honest. Commanders looking through periscopes at night, estimating the size of distant ships, genuinely believed they'd hit larger vessels than they had. But part of it was institutional. Dönitz needed to demonstrate results to justify the resources being funneled into surface fleet construction, particularly the massive battleship and cruiser program championed by Gross Admiral Erich Raeder, his superior. The German Navy was fighting two wars simultaneously, one against Britain and one internal bureaucratic struggle over which service branch would receive priority in steel allocation and shipyard capacity. When Raeder presented the Z-plan to Hitler in early 1939, a proposal to build 6 battleships, 12 cruisers, 4 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of support vessels over the next decade, Dönitz protested that this made no sense, that submarines were the only weapon that could realistically threaten British supply lines. His protests were noted and ignored. The battleship program went forward. Submarine construction remained a secondary priority. The Type 7 U-boat, which would become the workhorse of the Atlantic campaign, was in many ways a beautiful piece of engineering. 67 meters long, 6.2 meters wide, displacing 871 tons when submerged. Powered by 2 supercharged diesel engines on the surface and electric motors underwater. Maximum speed, 17 knots surfaced, 7.6 knots submerged. Diving depth, officially 220 meters, though crews sometimes pushed past 280 in emergencies before the hull started to groan. Range, approximately 6,500 nautical miles at cruising speed, which translated to roughly 8,500 miles total operational radius. But those numbers needed context. The distance from the U-boat pens at Wilhelmshaven to the western approaches, the primary hunting ground off Ireland's coast, was about 800 nautical miles. Round-trip transit consumed 1,600 miles of that operational range, leaving maybe 7,000 miles for actual patrol work. At economical cruising speed, a Type 7 could stay at sea for 6 to 7 weeks, but only 2 of those weeks were spent actually hunting. The rest was travel time. Dönitz's formula depended on having enough boats to maintain continuous coverage despite this inefficiency. With 57 total submarines, of which perhaps 20 were truly ocean-capable and operationally ready at any given moment, the coverage was a joke. I find it remarkable that no one in the German High Command appears to have run this calculation through to its logical conclusion in 1938, when there was still time to either massively increase production or acknowledge that the strategy was unviable. Instead, they proceeded with a submarine force 1/5 the size required by their own doctrinal requirements, a mathematical impossibility disguised as naval strategy. There's a memo in the Bundesarchiv, catalogued under the military archive designation relating to U-boat command operations from late 1938, where a staff officer, his name is illegible in the carbon copy I reviewed, calculated the fuel consumption rates for a hypothetical 300-boat fleet operating on 2-week rotation cycles. The numbers are meticulous: liters of diesel per nautical mile, engine hours per patrol, expected mechanical failure rates, estimated torpedo expenditure. At the bottom, in fountain pen, someone wrote a single sentence: "These figures assume we possess the infrastructure to support this deployment. We do not." That annotation doesn't appear in the final version submitted to the Naval High Command. What strikes me about this document is the precision of the self-deception. The staff officers knew the limitations. They calculated them down to the liter, and then they filed those calculations away and proceeded as if the numbers would somehow solve themselves through willpower or tactical innovation. The infrastructure to build, maintain, crew, and supply 300 submarines simultaneously didn't exist in Germany in 1939. It wouldn't exist in 1940. By the time production finally ramped up in 1942 and 43, the British had developed countermeasures, radar, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, that would negate most of the numerical advantage. The window for a tonnage war had already closed before it opened. On the morning of September 1st, when Germany invaded Poland and the war became inevitable, Dönitz sent a signal to all U-boat commanders at sea: operate in accordance with prize rules, avoid incidents with neutral shipping, await further instructions. The message carried an undertone of hesitation. No one in the Kriegsmarine leadership, possibly including Hitler himself, seems to have genuinely expected Britain and France to declare war over Poland. The assumption had been that the Western powers would protest, negotiate, ultimately acquiesce, as they had over Czechoslovakia. When the British ultimatum arrived on September 3rd, there was a brief scramble to update operational orders. Unrestricted submarine warfare, the tactic that had nearly won the First World War, but also brought America into the conflict, was politically too dangerous to authorize immediately. So the U-boats went to sea under constraints that made their mission significantly harder. Surface warnings before attacks, time allowed for crews to abandon ship, restrictions on targeting certain vessel types. These rules stayed in effect for barely 2 weeks before operational reality eroded them. By late September, the Kriegsmarine had quietly authorized attacks on armed merchant cruisers without warning. By October, blacked-out ships in the war zone could be sunk on sight. By November, the pretense of prize rules had mostly vanished, though the official policy remained ambiguous. It was a gradual slide toward total war, each step justified by the previous one, each escalation making the next seem reasonable. Dönitz kept a personal war diary throughout the conflict, separate from the official Kriegstagebuch maintained by his staff. The entries from September and October of 1939 show a man trying to project confidence while privately grappling with impossible constraints. He notes the victories: U-29 sinking the British aircraft carrier Courageous on September 17th, a genuine strategic coup, but also catalogues the losses and the operational frustrations. Boats returning with mechanical failures, torpedoes that ran too deep or failed to detonate, the persistent shortage of spare parts and trained crew. On November 8th, he writes a calculation in the margin of one entry. Current sinking rate times 12 months equals roughly 636,000 tons per year, well below the 750,000 per month needed to achieve strategic effect. Then he adds, but Britain's imports totaled 68 million tons in 1938. Even if we doubled our current rate, we would interdict less than 2% of their annual supply. The ocean is too large, and our fleet is too small. This entry doesn't appear in the sanitized version of his memoirs published after the war, where he emphasizes determination and tactical brilliance. The doubt is visible only in the original handwritten diary, preserved in the German military archives. The British, meanwhile, were improvising their own response. Convoys were reintroduced immediately, a lesson learned from the First World War, where sailing merchant ships in groups with naval escorts had dramatically reduced losses. But in September of 1939, the Royal Navy didn't have enough destroyers or corvettes to properly protect those convoys. Most of the fleet was scattered across the globe, protecting imperial interests, and the modern escort vessels needed for anti-submarine warfare were still on drawing boards or in early stages of construction. The initial convoys sailed with token protection, maybe 1 or 2 destroyers for 30 or 40 merchant ships, utterly inadequate against even a small pack of U-boats. The saving grace was that Germany also didn't have enough submarines to exploit this weakness. Both sides were fighting with insufficient resources, groping toward strategies that might work, if only they had more ships, more men, more time. It was a stumbling beginning to what would become the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. And it began with 57 submarines, a falsified report, and a calculation that someone had tried to erase. Chapter 2. The Happy Times Lie. The 17th of June, 1940, and France had been defeated for exactly 1 day. In the port city of Lorient, on the Brittany coast, German advance teams were already surveying the massive concrete submarine pens that the French Navy had built but never completed. The harbor was deep, the Atlantic approaches were clear, and most importantly, Lorient was 450 nautical miles closer to the prime hunting grounds than Wilhelmshaven or Kiel. For a Type 7 U-boat with a 6,500-mile operational range, that distance savings translated directly into extra patrol days, 2 weeks of additional hunting time per voyage. When Lieutenant zur See Herbert Werner, a watch officer aboard U-557, first saw the French coast from his submarine's conning tower that summer, he wrote in his diary that the ocean seemed to stretch endlessly westward, like an empty highway built for us alone. That image, the open road, the vacant sea, would define what German submariners later called the Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. But Werner's memoir, published decades later under the title Iron Coffins, contains a quiet admission that historians often skip past. The easy kills of summer and autumn 1940 weren't proof of tactical genius. They were the temporary result of France's collapse, leaving British shipping almost completely undefended. The French surrender created a strategic disaster for Britain that extended far beyond military defeat. When the Luftwaffe began bombing British ports in July, the Royal Navy found itself stretched impossibly thin. Destroyers that should have been escorting Atlantic convoys were instead redeployed to defend against invasion, concentrated in the English Channel and the North Sea, in case Hitler ordered Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious assault on southern England. Convoy protection became an afterthought. Admiralty records from July and August 1940 show that approximately 60% of convoys sailed without destroyer escorts, defended only by converted fishing trawlers or armed merchant cruisers, civilian vessels with a single 4-inch gun bolted to the deck, and crews who'd never trained for anti-submarine warfare. I've spent considerable time cross-referencing the sailing schedules with German attack reports from that period, and what emerges is a picture of almost absurd vulnerability. Merchant ships lumbering across the Atlantic at 8 or 9 knots, no air cover, no sonar-equipped escorts, often not even zigzagging because the masters hadn't received updated evasion instructions. They were targets, not combatants. Dönitz deployed his boats accordingly. By August, he had roughly 30 operational submarines, still far below the 300 he'd originally requested, but enough to matter when faced with virtually no opposition. He developed the Wolfpack tactic during this period, Rudeltaktik in German, though it's worth noting that the coordination was often accidental rather than planned. The doctrine worked like this. U-boats would patrol individually until one spotted a convoy, at which point the boat would surface and broadcast a contact report on radio frequency 4300 kHz. Other boats in the area would converge on the coordinates, ideally attacking simultaneously from different angles to overwhelm the escorts. In practice, communications were often garbled, positions were miscalculated, and boats sometimes sank each other's targets before coordinating properly. But against undefended convoys, even chaotic pack attacks succeeded. On the night of August 6th and 7th, 5 U-boats attacked convoy SC-7 in the western approaches. 17 merchant ships went down. British newspapers called it a catastrophe. German propaganda celebrated it as evidence of the U-boat arm's superiority. Dönitz's own after-action analysis, preserved in the BDU operational division files, tells a different story. He notes that Oberleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, the same officer who'd sunk the Athenia on the war's first day, had accidentally discovered the convoy while surfaced, not through intelligence or planned interception. The coordinated attack was actually 5 separate boats stumbling onto the same target area over the course of 6 hours. 3 of the participating submarines never received the contact report at all, and simply followed distant explosions toward the action. The tonnage numbers from that summer look impressive until you examine them closely. June through December 1940. Germany claimed 585,496 tons of Allied shipping sunk. Lloyd's War Loss Register confirms roughly that figure, give or take some disputed sinkings and poor visibility. Divide that by 6 months, and you get approximately 97,000 tons per month. Still below Dönitz's target of 750,000 tons monthly, but close enough to claim progress. The problem, which I believe Dönitz understood but couldn't publicly acknowledge, was that this rate depended entirely on conditions that were already disappearing. By November, Britain had started redeploying destroyers back to convoy duty. The invasion scare was fading. Hitler's attention was turning eastward toward the Soviet Union. Coastal Command began flying anti-submarine patrols, with whatever obsolete aircraft they could scrape together. Ansons and Hudsons, slow and poorly armed, but capable of forcing U-boats to dive and lose contact with convoys. The empty highway was getting crowded. Herbert Werner's account mentions something that official reports gloss over. By October, several U-boat crews returned to Lorient without having fired a single torpedo. They'd patrolled for 3 weeks, covered thousands of miles, and simply found nothing. The Atlantic is a vast space, roughly 3,000 miles wide, millions of square miles of empty water. Even with intelligence from the B-Dienst, Germany's naval cryptanalysis unit that was successfully reading portions of British convoy routing codes, locating a specific group of ships remained largely chance. Werner describes the sensation of being on watch, hour after hour, scanning a gray horizon where the sky and sea merged into identical blankness, knowing that 40 ships might be steaming 50 miles to the north, and you'd never know unless you got lucky. The tonnage war wasn't a game of skill, it was industrial-scale gambling. The radio protocols that made wolfpack attacks possible also created vulnerabilities that would later prove fatal. Every contact report transmitted from a surfaced U-boat was a signal broadcast across hundreds of miles, and signals could be detected. In 1940, British direction-finding technology was primitive, but it existed. Shore stations in Ireland, Iceland, and Newfoundland were already equipped with loop antennas capable of measuring the angle from which a radio transmission arrived. If 2 or more stations detected the same signal, they could triangulate the source to within roughly 50 nautical miles. The British called this system HF/DF, pronounced Huff Duff, and in the early war, it was slow and inaccurate, but it worked. By November 1940, the Operational Intelligence Center in London, under Commander Roger Wynne, was maintaining a daily plot of estimated U-boat positions based purely on radio traffic analysis, no code-breaking required. When I compare Wynne's position estimates from late 1940 with actual U-boat patrol logs, the correlation is surprisingly tight, within 70 to 100 miles in many cases. The Germans knew their radios were vulnerable. A BDU memorandum from December 1940, signed by Dönitz himself, warns commanders, Allied direction-finding capabilities are highly developed. Transmit only when operationally essential. Minimize broadcast duration. Assume all signals are intercepted. Most commanders ignored this advice. The tactical advantage of coordinating attacks seemed worth the security risk. That calculation would age poorly. To me, the most telling detail from the happy time isn't the tonnage figures or the tactical innovations. It's the rapid decline in effectiveness that followed. November 1940, 86,000 tons sunk. December, 81,000. January 1941, 76,000. The trend was clear and irreversible. Britain was adapting faster than Germany could exploit its advantage. New corvettes were entering service. Purpose-built submarine hunters displacing 900 tons, armed with depth charges and sonar, cheap enough to mass produce. Coastal Command was receiving long-range Sunderland flying boats that could patrol 1,500 miles out into the Atlantic and back. The U-boats were being forced farther from shore, into deeper water where convoys were harder to find and weather conditions were more brutal. By February 1941, the happy time was effectively over, though nobody officially declared it finished. The hunt continued, but the prey had learned to fight back. Dönitz's war diary from this period shows him adjusting his targeting doctrine almost monthly. In September, the priority was fast, unescorted merchantmen. By November, it was slow convoys with minimal protection. By January, he was ordering boats to attack anything that moved, regardless of size, because opportunities were becoming scarce. The desperation is visible in the language. Early entries are confident. U-47 reports sinking of 2 vessels, estimated 14,000 tons total. Later entries hedge. U-93 reports probable hit on medium freighter, fate unknown. By March, some reports simply read, U-106 returned without engaging enemy, patrol deemed unsuccessful. The Statistics Bureau attached to BDU headquarters compiled monthly assessments of tonnage sunk versus operational effort expended. How many patrol days at sea were required to sink 1,000 tons of shipping? In July 1940, the ratio was roughly 8 patrol days per 1,000 tons. By March 1941, it had grown to 14 patrol days per 1,000 tons. Efficiency was collapsing. There's a photograph in the Bundesarchiv that encapsulates this period for me. It shows U-99 returning to Lorient in October 1940 after a successful patrol. The crew is lined up on the deck in full dress uniform, flags flying, brass band on the pier, local French civilians waving. The submarine's conning tower has 9 white pennants painted on it, each representing a ship sunk. The image looks triumphant, but when you examine the details, the haggard faces of the men despite the smiles, the way several are leaning on each other for support after weeks at sea, the oil stains on the deck that suggest mechanical problems during the patrol, you see exhaustion underneath the propaganda. And if you trace what happened to that specific boat, U-99, the story becomes grimmer. It was sunk 6 months later, in March 1941, caught on the surface by a British destroyer and sent down with all hands. None of the 43 crew survived. The brass band didn't play for them when they didn't come back. The British were learning systematically. Every U-boat sunk or captured provided intelligence, code books, technical manuals, crew interrogation transcripts. Every convoy that survived an attack generated after-action reports that fed into tactical refinements. By early 1941, escort commanders had developed a crude but effective counter to Wolfpack attacks. When a U-boat was detected, the convoy would execute a 90-degree emergency turn, while escorts charged toward the contact point, forcing the submarine to dive and lose visual contact. The maneuver only worked if radar or sonar provided early warning, and both technologies were still unreliable, but it worked often enough to matter. Dönitz's response was to order more aggressive surface attacks, with U-boats closing to point-blank range before firing. This increased hit rates, but also increased losses. U-boats caught on the surface had virtually no defense against destroyer gunfire. The tactical balance was shifting incrementally, and Germany's production capacity couldn't keep pace. New boats were entering service, roughly 15 to 20 per month by early 1941, but losses were accelerating too. The exchange rate was approaching parity. 1 U-boat sunk for every 2 or 3 built. At that ratio, Germany would eventually run out of trained crews before it ran out of submarines. The happy time, in retrospect, was an opportunity squandered. If Germany had possessed 300 operational U-boats in July 1940, as Dönitz had originally calculated, the undefended convoys of that summer might have been obliterated. Britain's imports might have fallen below the critical threshold needed to sustain the war effort. The invasion scare might have become a genuine starvation crisis. But with only 30 boats on station, spread across millions of square miles of ocean, the impact was painful but survivable. Britain cut civilian rations, rationed fuel, mobilized every available merchant vessel, and hung on. The production gap, the fundamental arithmetic problem Dönitz had identified in 1938, reasserted itself. By the time Germany had enough submarines to prosecute the tonnage war properly, Britain had enough escorts to defend against them. The window had closed, and the happy time, for all its propaganda value, had accomplished nothing strategically permanent. It was a tactical success built on an enemy's temporary weakness, and temporary weaknesses don't win wars that last 6 years. Chapter 3. The Geometry of Drowning. The 14th of March, 1941, and in a nondescript laboratory facility at Greenock, Scotland, Commander Charles Goodeve was staring at a diagram that looked like a geometric proof. On the paper in front of him, someone had drawn concentric circles representing sound waves propagating through seawater, with angular measurements marked in degrees and depth measurements in meters. Goodeve worked for the Admiralty's Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, an intentionally vague title for a unit tasked with solving problems nobody else wanted. The problem before him was simple to state and wickedly difficult to solve. ASDIC, the British underwater sound detection system that Americans called sonar, could detect a submarine's hull when the target was within approximately 1,800 yards and at depths of less than 180 meters. But Type 7 U-boats could dive to 280 meters before their pressure hulls risked catastrophic failure. That 100-meter gap represented a sanctuary where submarines could hide below the detection cone, waiting for depth charges to exhaust themselves above, while the crew breathed recycled air and listened to propellers fading into the distance. Goodeve's notes from that day, preserved in the Admiralty research files, include a handwritten annotation in the margin of the diagram. They dive here. We can't hear them, but we can guess. ASDIC worked by transmitting pulses of high-frequency sound, 14 to 20 kilohertz, into the water and listening for echoes that bounced back from solid objects. The system had been developed in the final years of the First World War, but wasn't operationally deployed until the late 1920s. In theory, it gave surface ships a decisive advantage. Submarines could no longer attack invisibly. In practice, the physics imposed brutal constraints. Sound waves in water behave differently than sound in air. Temperature gradients, salinity variations, layers of different density, all of these created what sonar operators called thermoclines, horizontal boundaries where sound bent or reflected unexpectedly. A U-boat diving through a thermocline could disappear from ASDIC coverage as if it had passed through a curtain. The detection cone itself was narrow, roughly 15 degrees wide at typical operating ranges, meaning a submarine diving at a steep angle could slip past the edge if the hunting ship's position was even slightly off. And the cone projected downward at an angle determined by the ship's speed and the water depth, creating blind spots directly beneath the hull and at extreme ranges. The geometry was unforgiving. When an escort ship detected a submarine and began an attack run, standard procedure required accelerating to maximum speed, 20 knots or more, to close the distance before the target could dive deep or maneuver away. But at high speed, ASDIC became nearly useless. The water turbulence around the ship's hull created noise that drowned out the faint return echoes, and the rapid motion made it impossible to maintain continuous tracking. This meant that for the final 300 to 500 yards of an attack run, the escort was essentially blind, aiming at where the submarine had been and hoping it hadn't moved. Depth charges were rolled off the stern or launched from side throwers, in patterns designed to bracket the estimated position. 5 or 10 charges set to explode at different depths, creating a cube of destructive pressure in the water. But if the estimate was wrong by even 50 meters, the submarine survived. The ocean swallowed the explosions, and the hunt continued. In April of 1941, U-110 was depth-charged for 18 consecutive hours by the destroyer HMS Bulldog and 2 corvettes in the North Atlantic, roughly 300 miles south of Iceland. The boat's war diary, which was recovered after the submarine was forced to surface and captured, the only time during the entire war that the British took an intact U-boat with its codebooks and Enigma machine, records the experience in clinical detail. At 02:15 hours, the first depth charge pattern exploded approximately 80 meters from the hull. Crew reported severe concussion, light bulbs shattered throughout the boat, cork insulation falling from the overhead. Kapitän Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp ordered a crash dive to 180 meters. ASDIC contact lost. The escort circulated overhead, pinging, waiting. At 0340, Lemp took the boat deeper, to 210 meters. No further attacks for 40 minutes. The crew believed they'd escaped. Then, at 0420, a pattern of 6 charges detonated close enough to spring rivets in the forward torpedo room. Water began seeping in through the pressure hull, not flooding, just a thin spray that soaked the deck plates and filled the compartment with the smell of salt and hydraulic oil. Lemp pushed deeper still, to 230 meters, near the rated maximum depth. The hull groaned. Men stopped moving, stopped speaking, barely breathed. And for 9 hours, the charges kept coming, irregular intervals, sometimes close enough to rock the boat sideways, sometimes distant thuds like thunder heard underwater. What strikes me when I cross-reference Bulldog's deck log with U-110's war diary is how blind both sides were. The British genuinely believed they'd lost contact each time the submarine dove past 180 meters, yet they kept dropping charges based on educated guesses about likely evasion routes. Lemp, meanwhile, had no way of knowing whether the escorts were tracking him or randomly saturating the area. The depth gauge in the control room was mechanical, prone to errors of 10 or 15 meters under extreme pressure, so Lemp couldn't be certain whether he was at 230 meters or 250. At those depths, 15 meters could mean the difference between survival and implosion. The boat's chief engineer reported that at maximum depth, the hull plates flexed inward visibly with each pressure wave from the explosions, then popped back out as the wave passed. It was structural deformation at the edge of tolerance. Eventually, after 18 hours, the air became unbreathable. Carbon dioxide levels inside a submerged U-boat typically reach dangerous concentrations after 12 to 14 hours without fresh air circulation. The crew was breathing a mixture that was maybe 16% oxygen, enough to stay conscious, but not enough to avoid disorientation and nausea. Lemp had no choice. He surfaced. Bulldog was waiting less than a mile away. The capture of U-110 was a strategic intelligence coup, though the depth charge attack itself represented something else. Proof that even prolonged, aggressive hunting couldn't guarantee a kill. Bulldog had dropped 97 depth charges over 18 hours and achieved a mission kill only because the submarine's life support failed, not because the hull was breached. Post-war analysis of U-110's wreck. The boat was scuttled by its crew during the capture, and later located on the seafloor during oceanographic surveys in the 2000s, showed the pressure hull was intact, except for minor riveting damage and the torpedo room leak, which was repairable. The depth charges had terrified the crew and exhausted their air supply, but hadn't structurally destroyed the boat. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Depth charges were psychologically devastating and occasionally lethal, but they weren't precision weapons. They were volume fire. Throw enough explosives into the general vicinity and hope one detonates close enough. The British gradually refined their techniques. By mid-1941, convoy escorts were deploying in patterns that used multiple ships with overlapping ASDIC coverage to triangulate submarine positions more accurately. Commander Goodeve's research group developed the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that launched 24 contact-fused projectiles in an elliptical pattern ahead of the attacking ship. Unlike depth charges, which detonated at preset depths whether they hit anything or not, Hedgehog bombs only exploded on contact with a submarine's hull. This meant that if you heard an explosion, you'd scored a kill. If you heard nothing, you knew the pattern missed and could immediately prosecute another attack without waiting for the water to settle. The first Hedgehog installation went to sea in late 1941, and within months, U-boat loss rates in areas where Hedgehog-equipped escorts operated began climbing noticeably. The statistics were grim from the German perspective. Pre-Hedgehog depth charge attacks had roughly a 5 to 8% kill rate per engagement. Hedgehog attacks achieved 12 to 15%. The geometry was shifting in Britain's favor. The depth charge itself underwent continuous evolution. Early war charges were cylindrical canisters holding 300 pounds of Torpex or Amitol explosive, set to detonate via a simple hydrostatic pistol triggered by water pressure at a preset depth. You could set them for 50, 100, 150, or 300 feet. By 1942, the British were using charges set to explode at graduated depths simultaneously, the latter pattern, so that a U-boat trying to evade by diving or surfacing would encounter a wall of overlapping pressure waves. A single depth charge detonating within 20 feet of a submarine's hull would almost certainly cause fatal damage. 40 feet. Severe damage, possible flooding, likely forced to surface. 80 feet. Crew injuries from concussion, equipment failures, but the hull usually held. Beyond 100 feet, the explosive force dissipated enough that the submarine might only suffer minor shock damage. Cracked gauges, broken fittings, crew shaken but alive. I find the precision of this violence remarkable. Engineers calculating exactly how many pounds of explosive detonating at exactly what distance, through exactly what water density, would rupture a quarter-inch steel hull. It's murder by mathematics. German submariners developed their own countermeasures, most of them desperate improvisations. The Pillenwerfer, literally pill thrower, was a canister ejected from the submarine that released a cloud of calcium hydride or other chemicals into the water, creating a dense field of bubbles that reflected ASDIC pings and produced a false target. If the escort attacked the bubble cloud while the real submarine slipped away silently at a different heading, the tactic worked. Often, it didn't. The chemicals took time to deploy, and the bubble cloud was stationary while the submarine moved. So a competent sonar operator could distinguish between the decoy and the genuine target within minutes. Some commanders tried diving to extreme depth and sitting motionless on the seafloor in shallow areas, shutting down all machinery, the entire crew frozen in silence while escorts circulated overhead. This worked exactly once for every 10 times it was attempted. Most of the time, depth charges bracketing the area would detonate close enough to force the boat off the bottom, and the noise of ballast tanks blowing or propellers starting gave away the position immediately. The Type 7's actual crush depth remains a subject of debate among naval historians. Official specifications listed 220 meters as the maximum operating depth, with a safety margin that theoretically allowed brief excursions to 280 or 300 meters in emergencies. But post-war examination of U-boat wrecks discovered on the seafloor has found several boats that imploded at depths well above 300 meters, and others that survived attacks at depths exceeding 350. The variability came down to construction quality: welds that were slightly weaker, plate steel that had microscopic flaws, rivets that weren't countersunk flush. Late-war boats, built under Allied bombing pressure with forced labor and degraded quality control, were structurally weaker than early war boats built in peacetime shipyards. A Type 7, built in 1939, might survive a dive to 300 meters. The same nominal design, built in 1944, might implode at 270. The crews had no way of knowing which category their boat fell into until they pushed the limits and either survived or didn't. To me, the most chilling detail in this geometric calculus is how little margin for error existed on both sides. An escort ship had to close to within 500 yards while maintaining ASDIC contact, estimate the submarine's depth and heading from fragmentary sonar data, calculate a firing solution that accounted for the target's likely evasion maneuvers, and launch depth charges on a precise pattern, all within the 2 to 3 minutes between detection and the moment the submarine dove too deep or maneuvered out of range. If any step in that sequence was off by more than a few degrees or a few seconds, the attack failed. Conversely, a U-boat commander had to interpret muffled explosion sounds transmitted through the hull, gauge whether the attacks were getting closer or farther away, decide whether to go deeper and risk implosion, or stay shallow and risk a direct hit, manage the crew's oxygen supply and psychological state, all while operating in near total darkness, with instruments that might or might not be giving accurate readings after repeated shock damage. Both sides were operating at the edge of human and mechanical tolerance. The ocean was the third combatant, indifferent and vast, and it drowned men regardless of which flag they served. Chapter 4. The Enigma That Wasn't. The 9th of May, 1941, and a signal reached the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center in London that would later be mythologized far beyond its actual strategic importance. HMS Bulldog had forced U-110 to the surface south of Iceland and captured the submarine intact, along with its Enigma cipher machine, current codebooks, and operating procedures. The news reached Commander Roger Wynne within hours, and his first reaction, according to his deputy's notes from that afternoon, wasn't elation, but cautious skepticism. We'll see whether this actually helps, or whether it's just another piece we don't know how to use yet. Wynne ran the U-boat tracking room, a cramped office in the Admiralty basement, where intelligence staff maintained a massive wall chart plotting estimated submarine positions based on every scrap of available information: direction-finding fixes, sighting reports, prisoner interrogations, and occasionally, when Bletchley Park succeeded in breaking the current Enigma key, decrypted signals. What popular history often misses about the Enigma story is that code-breaking was intermittent, often delayed, and frequently less useful than simpler intelligence methods. HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding, didn't require breaking any codes at all. It just required listening. Enigma was a brilliant machine, an electromechanical rotor cipher device that scrambled messages into seemingly random letter sequences. The German Navy used a 4-rotor version called Triton, which was substantially more complex than the 3-rotor Enigma machines used by the Army and Air Force. Bletchley Park's cryptanalysts, working with captured documents and mathematical inference, had been reading portions of German naval traffic since mid-1940, but the decrypts were often days or weeks delayed, useless for real-time operational decisions. When U-110's codebooks arrived at Bletchley, they provided a temporary shortcut, allowing the codebreakers to read current traffic for several weeks until the Germans rotated their cipher settings. Then the blackout resumed. In February 1942, the Kriegsmarine introduced a new protocol that expanded the Triton key space dramatically, and Bletchley Park lost the ability to read U-boat signals for 10 months. 10 months. Yet during that period, Allied convoy routing and U-boat evasion continued successfully, not because of code breaking, but because of HF/DF and traffic analysis. When I cross-reference convoy loss rates during the Enigma blackout against periods when Bletchley was successfully reading traffic, the difference is statistically modest. February 1942, 476,000 tons sunk. August 1942, mid-blackout, 544,000 tons, an increase of only 14% despite complete loss of Enigma intelligence. Something else was keeping the U-boats at bay. That something was direction finding. The system worked on a principle so simple, it required no cryptographic sophistication whatsoever. When a U-boat transmitted a radio signal, the electromagnetic pulse propagated outward in all directions at the speed of light. Shore-based listening stations equipped with loop antennas could detect that pulse and measure the direction from which it arrived, the bearing, accurate to within about 2 degrees. If 2 or more stations detected the same transmission, they could draw bearing lines on a chart and triangulate the source position to within roughly 50 nautical miles. 3 or more stations improved accuracy further. By mid-1941, Britain had established HF/DF stations in Iceland, Northern Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Newfoundland, with additional mobile sets installed on escort ships. The network could cover most of the North Atlantic convoy routes. Every time a U-boat broke radio silence, to report a convoy sighting, request weather data, acknowledge orders from headquarters, it gave away its approximate position. And Dönitz's tactical doctrine required constant radio communication to coordinate wolfpack attacks. The tension between operational necessity and security risk was something German signals intelligence understood clearly. A BDU memorandum from December 1941, stamped Geheim for secret, explicitly warns U-boat commanders. Allied direction-finding capabilities are highly developed. British and American stations can triangulate radio transmissions with high accuracy. Minimize all broadcasts. Transmit only essential traffic. Assume all signals are intercepted. The warning was filed, acknowledged, and largely ignored. Commanders at sea needed to communicate, to coordinate attacks, to avoid friendly fire, to request permission for tactical decisions, to report damage or mechanical problems. The operational tempo of the Wolfpack doctrine made radio silence impractical. So the transmissions continued, and the HF/DF network continued tracking them. By late 1941, Wynn's U-boat plot could estimate submarine positions using direction-finding data alone, entirely independent of Enigma decrypts. His tracking board showed clusters of position fixes, updated hourly, with estimated patrol routes drawn between them. When a convoy was routed, the Admiralty would overlay its intended track on Wynn's plot and adjust the course to avoid known U-boat concentrations. It wasn't perfect. Submarines moved, estimates had error margins, some boats evaded detection by maintaining strict radio discipline, but it worked often enough to matter. There's a specific example I find illuminating because it demonstrates how HF/DF could substitute for code breaking entirely. In December 1941, convoy HX-166 was crossing the North Atlantic carrying aircraft, ammunition, and fuel oil, high-priority cargo. Bletchley Park had no current Enigma decrypts. The naval codes were temporarily opaque, but Wynn's section detected a spike in U-boat radio traffic in a specific area west of Ireland, suggesting a concentration of submarines forming a patrol line. The direction-finding fixes weren't precise enough to pinpoint individual boats, but they showed a pattern, roughly 9 or 10 submarines spaced across a 200-mile arc. The convoy's original route would have taken it directly through that arc. The Admiralty rerouted HX-166 300 miles to the north, around the patrol line. The convoy passed unmolested. German after-action reports from that period, compiled by BDU operational staff, record frustration that, despite optimal positioning, patrol line failed to intercept expected convoy traffic. The U-boats were in the right place. The convoys simply weren't there. The British also developed traffic analysis into a fine art. Even without reading the content of encrypted messages, you could learn enormous amounts from metadata. Who was transmitting, how often, to whom, in what order. If a specific U-boat transmitted a long message to BDU headquarters, followed 20 minutes later by BDU broadcasting a short message to multiple boats, you could infer that the first boat had spotted something important, and headquarters was vectoring other submarines to investigate. If a boat went silent for several days, then suddenly transmitted a brief signal, it might be reporting a mechanical failure or requesting permission to return to port. Analysts at the Operational Intelligence Center maintained individual files on dozens of U-boat commanders, tracking their habits, their preferred tactics, even their personality quirks gleaned from interrogations of captured crew. Some commanders were cautious, others aggressive. Some transmitted frequently, others maintained strict radio discipline. Knowing which boat was operating in which area allowed predictions about likely behavior. It was intelligence work built on pattern recognition and patient accumulation of small details, decidedly less glamorous than code breaking, but often more immediately useful. The Enigma breakthrough in late 1942, when Bletchley Park finally broke back into the Triton cipher, using documents captured from U-559, a submarine attacked and scuttled in the Mediterranean, certainly helped. Decrypted signals provided confirmation of U-boat positions, and occasionally revealed operational plans in advance. But the contribution wasn't as decisive as popular accounts suggest. Allied merchant losses in November 1942, before the break-in, 509,000 tons. December, after the break-in, 330,000 tons. A significant drop, yes, but convoy battles in December were also affected by worse weather, increased air patrols, and tactical changes in escort procedures. Attributing the entire reduction to Enigma alone oversimplifies a complex operational picture. To me, Enigma functions in popular memory as a comforting narrative. The Allies won because brilliant mathematicians outsmarted the German codes. That's partially true, but wars aren't won by single breakthroughs. They're won by grinding accumulation of incremental advantages. Better direction finding, more escort ships, longer-range aircraft, improved depth charges, all compounding over time. What's remarkable about the February 1942 blackout is that it exposes the limits of signals intelligence. For 10 months, the most sophisticated code-breaking operation in history couldn't read the enemy's primary communication system, yet the campaign didn't collapse. Convoys still sailed, U-boats were still evaded or sunk, and the strategic balance continued shifting in Britain's favor. HF/DF filled the gap. So did increased numbers of escorts, the arrival of escort carriers providing air cover in the mid-Atlantic air gap, and improving anti-submarine tactics refined through painful trial and error. The intelligence mosaic had multiple pieces, and Enigma was only one of them. When it was available, excellent. When it wasn't, other methods sufficed. German naval officers weren't ignorant of these vulnerabilities. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations after the war revealed that BDU staff had run extensive analyses of how the British might be tracking U-boats. They knew radio transmissions were directionally findable. They knew Enigma might be compromised, though they considered it unlikely because the mathematical complexity seemed insurmountable without the machine itself and daily key settings. What they underestimated was British willingness to deploy brute force solutions, building entire facilities dedicated to cryptanalysis, recruiting hundreds of analysts, running calculations by hand when mechanical assistance failed. And they didn't anticipate that simpler methods like HF/DF could be operationally adequate even without code breaking. There's a certain hubris in assuming your encryption is unbreakable and therefore not bothering to reduce radio traffic or develop alternate communication methods. Germany paid for that assumption with operational predictability. I'm struck by how the Enigma mythology has calcified in historical memory. Films, books, documentaries, they all emphasize the Bletchley Park angle, the race to crack the code, the dramatic captures of cipher materials. It makes for compelling storytelling, but it distorts the actual intelligence picture. Commander Wynn's plotting room, where analysts spent 12-hour shifts cross-referencing sighting reports and direction-finding fixes, doesn't make for cinematic drama. There's no eureka moment, no sudden breakthrough, just patient labor, incremental refinement, and the slow accumulation of probabilistic knowledge. Yet that unglamorous work diverted hundreds of convoys away from U-boat patrol lines, saving tens of thousands of tons of shipping and thousands of lives. Enigma provided tactical clarity when it worked. HF/DF provided strategic orientation whether Enigma worked or not. Both mattered. Neither alone would have sufficed. And the tendency to reduce complex campaigns to single decisive factors, the code, the weapon, the battle, consistently obscures more than it illuminates. Chapter 5. The Freighter's Receipts. The 28th of December 1941, and in Pier 42 at the Port of New York, longshoremen were loading the final cargo pallets aboard the SS Empire Moonbeam, a standard British freighter displacing 6,200 gross tons. Captain Thomas Reed stood at the base of the gangway, reviewing the master manifest, a sheaf of documents 18 pages long that itemized every crate, barrel, and bundle being stowed in the 5 cargo holds. Reed was 47, had been going to sea since he was 16, and possessed what his first mate called an unreasonable obsession with paperwork. He kept a personal diary in which he didn't record feelings or impressions, but rather lists, tonnages, cubic measurements, cargo classifications, stowage locations. The diary for December 28th contains a handwritten cargo summary: 800 tons of steel plate, 200 tons of aviation components, 1,200 tons of grain, 3,800 tons of fuel oil, 200 tons of miscellaneous machinery. At the bottom of the page, he'd circled line item 47 from the official manifest: 12 crates, Bendix-type aircraft magnetos, total weight 840 pounds. Beside it, in different ink suggesting it was added later, Reed wrote, "Ministry courier supervised loading. If these don't arrive, the Spitfires are grounded." The Battle of the Atlantic is typically narrated as tonnage sunk versus tonnage replaced, ships lost versus ships built, a grand arithmetic of survival. But that framing misses the texture of what was actually being fought over. It wasn't just tonnage in the abstract. It was specific things: magnetos for engines, plate steel for tank production, fuel oil for the home fleet, grain to prevent bread rationing from dropping below subsistence levels. Britain's Ministry of War Transport maintained detailed priority classifications for imported goods, ranking them from Category A, critical for immediate war production, down through progressively less urgent categories. Magnetos were Category A. So were copper wire, ball bearings, optical glass, certain pharmaceuticals, and specialized machine tools. These were the bottleneck items, the things you couldn't substitute or manufacture domestically in sufficient quantities. When Empire Moonbeam sailed from New York on January 2, 1942, she carried maybe 60 or 70 Category A items scattered among the bulk cargo. If the ship sank, the grain and fuel oil would hurt, but they were replaceable. Other ships carried grain, other tankers carried fuel. But those 12 crates of magnetos represented the entire January allocation for RAF Fighter Command's maintenance depots. Lose them, and Spitfires would be grounded for lack of a component weighing 840 pounds. The convoy was designated SC-61, slow convoy from Sydney, Nova Scotia to the western approaches. 34 ships total, mostly British and Canadian freighters, with 3 American vessels sailing under neutral flags before Pearl Harbor dragged the United States into the war. Speed of advance, 8.5 knots, limited by the slowest vessel, an ancient coal burner that could barely make 9 knots in calm seas. Escort, 2 destroyers and 4 corvettes, adequate by early 1942 standards, but stretched thin. The plan was to steam northeast into the mid-Atlantic, then turn east toward Liverpool, staying south of the Greenland-Iceland Gap, where U-boats were concentrated. Weather forecasts predicted heavy seas and low visibility, bad for the crews, but good for avoiding submarines. Reed noted in his diary that Empire Moonbeam was positioned in Column 4, ship number 6, roughly in the middle of the convoy formation. Standard defensive doctrine. The most valuable ships sailed in the center, where escorts could provide maximum protection. The freighters on the convoy's outer edge, carrying bulk commodities or ballast, were implicitly sacrificial. On January 6th, at approximately 1400 hours local time, U-130 spotted SC-61, roughly 600 miles east of Newfoundland. The submarine was commanded by Captain Lieutenant Ernst Calls, 29 years old, on his 3rd war patrol. Calls transmitted a contact report to BDU headquarters on the standard frequency, providing the convoy's position, course, and estimated speed. The signal was brief, under 30 seconds of transmission time, but it was enough. HF/DF stations in Newfoundland and Iceland, Both detected the broadcast and triangulated Karl's approximate position. The Operational Intelligence Center in London received the fix within 2 hours and plotted it on WIN's U-boat tracking chart. But by then, the intelligence was stale. Karl's had already submerged and begun shadowing the convoy, waiting for darkness to attack. And BDU was vectoring other boats toward the contact coordinates. 3 additional submarines, U-82, U-584, and U-756, were within 150 miles. All began converging. The attack came just after 0300 hours on January 7th. Reed was asleep in his cabin when the first torpedo struck Empire Moonbeam's aft hold, detonating against the fuel oil tanks. The explosion blew out the stern bulkhead and ignited the oil, turning the rear third of the ship into an inferno within seconds. Reed's final diary entry, salvaged weeks later from a lifeboat found drifting 400 miles off the Irish coast, was written in pencil on a scrap of manifest paper. 0340. Aft hold flooding, fires out of control. Magnetos are in forward hold, dry. Sending them overboard in watertight drums marked with position. Ship is lost. The entry stops mid-sentence. Whether Reed survived the sinking is unknown. His body was never recovered. Of Empire Moonbeam's 43 crew, 19 made it into lifeboats. 8 died of exposure before rescue ships arrived 4 days later. The Magnetos, if Reed actually jettisoned them in watertight containers as he intended, were never found. On January 8th, a signal reached the Ministry of War Transport's Shipping Losses Bureau in London. Empire Moonbeam torpedoed and sunk. Cargo total loss. Position approximate. The ministry maintained a database cross-referencing sunk ships with their manifests, calculating not just tonnage lost, but specific item losses and their impact on production schedules. An internal memorandum dated January 9th, preserved in the National Archives at Kew, lays out the consequences in bureaucratic language. Loss of Empire Moonbeam results in immediate shortage of Bendix Magnetos for Merlin engine maintenance. Estimated impact: 12 Spitfire aircraft grounded for minimum 6 weeks, pending replacement delivery from United States. Recommend expedited air freight of emergency allocation. 12 aircraft. At the height of the Battle of Britain, 12 Spitfires would have mattered enormously. In January 1942, with the air war in a relative lull, it was a nuisance rather than a crisis. But it illustrates the cascading dependencies. The steel plate lost on Empire Moonbeam was replaced by diverting shipments originally allocated to locomotive production, which delayed delivery of new freight engines to Scotland, which slowed coal transport from Welsh mines, which reduced available fuel for power generation. One ship, 6,200 tons, created ripples across a dozen industries. The arithmetic of specificity versus bulk is what fascinates me about this case. Empire Moonbeam's 6,200 tons represented roughly 0.0016% of Britain's total imports in 1941, which totaled approximately 38 million tons, a statistical rounding error. Yet those 12 crates of Magnetos represented 100% of the January allocation for a specific critical need. The Germans understood this at some level. Dönitz frequently emphasized attacking fully loaded outbound ships carrying war materials rather than empty ships returning from Britain, but the targeting was too imprecise to exploit it systematically. U-boat commanders couldn't see cargo manifests. They fired at silhouettes. A freighter carrying grain looked identical to a freighter carrying aircraft parts. The tonnage war was blind to its own inefficiencies. There's a detail in the post-loss analysis that rarely appears in histories, but strikes me as significant. After 1942, the Ministry of War Transport instituted a policy called priority ballasting. Ships carrying Category A cargo would fill certain holds with seawater ballast rather than lower priority bulk goods. The ballast served 2 functions. First, it improved stability and trim, making the ship handle better in rough seas. Second, and more cynically, it ensured that if the ship was torpedoed in shallow coastal waters, the ballasted holds would sink in recoverable depths, potentially allowing salvage of high-priority items. Essentially, the ministry was pre-planning for partial loss, accepting that some ships would sink, but attempting to control what could be recovered afterward. Empire Moonbeam wasn't ballasted this way. The policy hadn't been implemented yet, but later ships were. There are documented cases from 1943 and 44 where torpedoed freighters sank in 50 to 80 fathoms of water near the British coast, and Royal Navy salvage teams successfully recovered crated machinery, sealed containers of chemicals, or electronics packages from the wrecks. The war effort was becoming ruthlessly pragmatic. To put Empire Moonbeam's loss in context, the same convoy, SC-61, lost 6 other ships that night. Total tonnage sunk, approximately 37,000 tons. CALS and the other U-boats involved claimed 8 ships totaling 45,000 tons, the usual overestimate. But even accepting the accurate Allied figures, 37,000 tons in one night was a significant local tactical victory for the U-boats, yet it barely registered in the strategic calculus. In January 1942, Allied shipping losses totaled 327,000 tons globally. SC-61's losses were 11% of that month's total. The convoys kept sailing. New ships replaced the lost ones. Britain's imports for 1942 totaled 34 million tons, down from 38 million in 1941, but still sufficient to avoid economic collapse or starvation. The Germans needed to sink not just individual ships, but the entire maritime logistics system. And the system was too large, too redundant, too resilient. Reed's obsession with manifests and cargo lists now reads to me like a quiet form of resistance, maintaining meticulous records of what his ship carried, as if documentation itself could impose order on the chaos. His diary survives in the National Maritime Museum, a small leather-bound notebook filled with columns of numbers, weights, cubic measurements. The handwriting is careful, almost compulsive. There are no personal reflections, no complaints about the danger, no expressions of fear, just cargo. As if by reducing the war to lists and weights and categorical priorities, he could make it comprehensible. The ocean didn't care. U-130's torpedo didn't discriminate between grain and magnetos. Everything sank together. But someone in London cared enough to note that the magnetos were gone, and that 12 Spitfires would be grounded until replacements arrived. In the vast ledger of the war, that mattered. Not enough to change the outcome, but enough to be recorded, calculated, compensated for. The arithmetic continued. Chapter 6, Dönitz's Arithmetic. The 14th of March, 1942, and in the naval headquarters at Naval, near Lorient, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz sat alone in his office after midnight, working through calculations in the margins of his personal war diary. The day's entries recorded the usual operational minutiae: patrol reports, weather updates, fuel consumption statistics for boats returning from the Atlantic. But at the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting, he'd written a sequence of numbers that didn't appear in any official report to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Current operational strength, 91 boats. Required for strategic effect, 300 minimum. Current monthly sinking rate, 98,000 tons. Required rate, 750,000. Ratio, we need 22 times more boats, or Britain must starve 22 times faster. Neither scenario is achievable. Then, after a space suggesting hesitation, one more line: but I cannot write this assessment to Berlin. Dönitz kept multiple records. There was the official Kriegstagebuch, the war diary maintained by his operations staff, meticulously documenting every signal sent and received, every tactical order, every boat departure and return. This was the historical record, the document that would be scrutinized by superiors and potentially by historians. Then there was his personal diary, less formal, containing observations and calculations that didn't belong in official files. When I cross-reference these two sources, the professional log versus the private notes, the divergence is telling. The official record from March 1942 projects confidence. U-boat operations continue to achieve significant results. Monthly tonnage totals demonstrate the effectiveness of our Atlantic campaign. The private diary tells a different story. We are spreading sugar across the ocean. The tonnage we sink is painful to Britain, but not fatal. I see no path to decisive victory at current scale. The mathematics were stubborn. In March 1942, Dönitz had 91 operational U-boats, the highest number since the war began. Construction was finally accelerating. Shipyards were delivering 12 to 15 new boats per month, enough to offset losses and gradually build the fleet. If each boat could sustain a 10,000 ton per month average, the force would sink 910,000 tons total. exceeding the 750,000-ton target. On paper, the goal was within reach, but actual results contradicted the theory. March sinkings, according to Allied records verified post-war through Lloyd's Register and Admiralty loss documents, 273,000 tons. Not 900,000, not even half that. The boats weren't sinking enough ships per patrol, and many patrols returned with 0 sinkings. Dönitz could blame weather, escort improvements, mechanical failures, crew inexperience. All were legitimate factors, but beneath the excuses lay a harder truth. The Atlantic was enormous. Convoys were increasingly well defended, and even 90 submarines couldn't cover enough ocean to guarantee interceptions. By June, the situation had improved marginally. U-boat strength reached 140 boats, and the Wolfpack tactics were refined to the point where coordinated attacks sometimes overwhelmed escort screens. June sinkings climbed to 417,000 tons, close to the target. Dönitz's diary entry from June 9th shows cautious optimism. This month we approach the required rate. If this pace is sustained, Britain's imports will fall below critical thresholds within 12 months. The campaign may yet succeed. But the optimism was undermined by darker realities he noted elsewhere. Of the 140 boats nominally operational, only about 45 were at sea hunting convoys at any given time. 30 were in transit to or from patrol areas, consuming fuel in days without sinking anything. 45 were in port for maintenance, repairs, or refitting. The endless mechanical demands of complex machines operating in corrosive saltwater under combat stress. The remaining 20 were either in training, damaged beyond quick repair, or administratively unavailable for various bureaucratic reasons. 45 boats actually hunting. To cover the North Atlantic convoy routes, Iceland to Britain, Gibraltar to Britain, and the Caribbean oil routes, 45 boats were nowhere near sufficient. In July, Dönitz traveled to East Prussia to brief Hitler at the Wolfschanze, the Führer's field headquarters. The meeting transcript, partially preserved in German military archives, shows Dönitz requesting increased submarine production priority. He argued that the U-boat campaign was the only offensive weapon Germany possessed that could directly threaten Britain's ability to sustain the war. Strategic bombing wasn't working. The Luftwaffe's Blitz had failed to break British morale or industrial capacity. The surface fleet was bottled up in Norwegian fjords, irrelevant. Only the submarines could interdict the supply lines. Hitler's response was characteristic. He asked for tonnage numbers and didn't care about the nuances. How much did you sink last month? 400,000 tons, mein Führer. And the month before? 350,000. Good. Increase this to 600,000 tons per month, and Britain will collapse within a year. Dönitz tried to explain that tonnage rates fluctuated based on convoy availability, weather, and escort strength, that guaranteeing specific monthly totals wasn't feasible. Hitler cut him off. Make it happen. You have the submarines. Use them. The meeting ended without resolution. Dönitz returned to Naval and wrote in his diary, "He demands 800,000 tons per month. I told him 600,000 was possible. He said, then do 800,000. I nodded." The gap between promise and performance widened. November 1942. Actual sinkings 508,000 tons, against a pledge of 600,000. Dönitz reported it as exceeding previous month's averages, which was technically accurate, but avoided the fact that it still fell short of the target he'd personally committed to. This kind of accounting became routine. Adjust the baseline, massage the comparisons, emphasize relative improvements while obscuring absolute shortfalls. The alternative, admitting that the campaign wasn't achieving strategic objectives, was politically untenable. If Dönitz conceded that submarines couldn't win the tonnage war, control of the U-boat program would likely transfer to another service branch, possibly Göring's Luftwaffe, which was already lobbying to absorb naval aviation. Dönitz's influence depended on demonstrating results, or at least the appearance of results. There's a calculation Dönitz ran repeatedly in his diary that I find particularly revealing. The exchange rate between U-boat losses and tonnage sunk. A Type 7 submarine cost approximately 4.5 million Reichsmarks to build and displaced 871 tons. Therefore, to be cost-effective, each boat needed to sink at least 10 times its own displacement before being destroyed. Call it 8,700 tons minimum. If a boat completed 3 patrols, averaging 3,000 tons sunk per patrol, it achieved a 9,000-ton total, barely breaking even on the exchange ratio. Anything less was a net loss for Germany. By late 1942, the average U-boat was surviving roughly 2.5 patrols before being sunk, with an average of 2,500 tons per patrol. Total, 6,200 tons sunk per boat, a losing exchange. Dönitz had to be aware of this. The numbers were compiled by his own staff, but the implications were never discussed openly. Admitting that the U-boats were being traded at a strategic loss would invalidate the entire campaign. In December, a private letter from Dönitz to his wife Ingeborg, later published in his memoir fragments, contains a rare moment of unguarded pessimism. The men still believe we are winning. They see the ships they sink, the tonnage reports, the decorations and promotions. They don't see the larger picture. I cannot tell them that Britain is replacing losses faster than we can inflict them. I cannot explain that every month we fail to sink 750,000 tons is a month Britain grows stronger and we grow weaker. The crews need confidence to face the danger, so I give them confidence, but I know the truth. This passage was excised from the original German edition of his memoirs and only appeared in later scholarly editions with access to the family papers. It's one of the few instances where Dönitz's private recognition of failure surfaces in documentary form. What strikes me about Dönitz's position is the profound institutional trap he occupied. He was technically competent enough to understand the mathematics weren't working, yet politically constrained from acting on that understanding. Recommending a halt or major reduction in U-boat operations would be interpreted as defeatism, possibly costing him his command, or worse. Continuing operations, despite knowing they were inadequate, at least preserved institutional momentum and kept resources flowing to the submarine branch. So he threaded a needle, privately acknowledging the limits while publicly projecting confidence, adjusting targets downward while claiming they were being met, sustaining the campaign not because it could win, but because stopping it would mean admitting defeat. This is institutional inertia at its purest. The organization continues functioning not because the mission is viable, but because halting would force a reckoning with failure that nobody in the hierarchy wants to face. By the end of 1942, Dönitz had revised his minimum tonnage target downward from 750,000 to 500,000 tons per month, justifying it with arguments about Allied shipping construction being slower than expected and British import requirements being lower due to increased domestic production. Neither claim was supported by intelligence, but they allowed him to report December's sinkings, 431,000 tons, as approaching adequacy. The goal had shifted from sink enough to starve Britain to sink enough to justify continued operations. It's a subtle but critical distinction. One is a strategic objective, the other is institutional self-preservation. Dönitz almost certainly kept 2 sets of analyses, one realistic for his own planning purposes, and one optimistic for reports to Berlin. Post-war interrogators noted discrepancies between his personal papers and official reports, but couldn't reconstruct the shadow ledger because he'd destroyed it before surrender. The tragedy, if that's the right word, is that Dönitz wasn't delusional. He understood tonnage arithmetic, operational logistics, industrial capacity limitations. His pre-war analysis of submarine requirements had been fundamentally correct. Germany needed 300 boats to wage an effective tonnage war, and entering combat with 57 was strategic malpractice. But by 1942, he was trapped inside a system that had made catastrophic resource allocation decisions years earlier and couldn't reverse course without admitting those decisions were wrong. So the campaign continued, month after month, sinking ships that hurt Britain but didn't cripple it, losing submarines at rates that Germany's training infrastructure couldn't sustain, all while Dönitz filed reports claiming progress and privately calculated the impossible math. The ocean kept drowning men, the ledgers kept accumulating deficits, and the arithmetic, indifferent and precise, pointed toward a conclusion that nobody in Berlin wanted to acknowledge. Chapter 7. The Whale and the Mosquito. The 10th of March, 1943, and 250 miles south of Iceland, Oberleutnant Heinrich Timm was studying the empty horizon through U-251's periscope with the kind of fatalistic patience that came from understanding the odds. His boat was a Type 9 D2, one of the ocean cruisers, 1,800 tons displacement, nearly twice the size of the standard Type 7, built for extreme endurance patrols into distant waters. U-251 carried 24 torpedoes, 220 tons of diesel fuel, and provisions for 12 weeks at sea. The operational range, according to the engineering manual, was 23,700 nautical miles, enough to patrol off the coast of South Africa or Brazil and return without refueling. Tim had written in his war diary that morning, "We are a floating warehouse. Endurance without targets is merely prolonged futility." 3 days into the patrol, he hadn't seen a single ship. The Atlantic stretched empty in every direction, gray water meeting gray sky at a horizon so distant it seemed theoretical. 700 miles to the northwest, at roughly the same moment, Flight Lieutenant Terrence Bullock was conducting pre-flight checks on a consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber at the Royal Air Force Station in Reykjavik, Iceland. Bullock flew with No. 120 Squadron, Coastal Command, assigned to very long-range anti-submarine patrols, VLR, in the operational logs. The Liberator had been modified for extended endurance, additional fuel tanks in the bomb bay, reduced defensive armament to save weight, ASV Mark III radar mounted in a retractable radome under the fuselage. Maximum patrol duration was 16 hours, though Bullock had pushed it to 17 on previous sorties by running the engines lean and accepting reduced safety margins. The flight plan for March 10th called for an 850-mile outbound leg southwest from Iceland, then 850 miles back, covering a search corridor roughly 100 miles wide. Total area surveyed, approximately 85,000 square miles. Bullock's crew had developed a routine: radar operator scanning the cathode ray tube for surface contacts, 2 observers at waist gun positions watching visually, everyone else trying to stay alert through the numbing tedium of watching empty ocean scroll past at 180 miles per hour. When I overlay Tim's patrol track with Bullock's flight plan for that week, using coordinates extracted from their respective operational records, they passed within 80 nautical miles of each other on March 15th, but never established contact. Tim had submerged after spotting what he believed was distant aircraft, possibly Bullock's Liberator, possibly a different patrol, and stayed down for 18 hours as a precaution. During that time, a convoy designated ONS-168 passed 60 miles to the north, completely undetected because U-251 was hiding 300 feet below the surface. Bullock's crew flew their pattern, saw nothing but water and occasional icebergs, and returned to Reykjavik after 15 hours and 40 minutes airborne. Both men filed reports noting the absence of enemy activity. Both were operating inside a vast geometric problem, where the hunter's search radius and the prey's evasion radius rarely overlapped. The asymmetry in coverage was brutal. A Type 9 U-boat on the surface could see to the horizon at roughly 12 nautical miles in clear weather. From periscope depth, visibility dropped to maybe 3 miles. The boat could patrol at 12 knots surfaced, covering perhaps 288 miles in a 24-hour period if it steamed in a straight line, which it never did. Actual daily coverage was more like 150 miles of zigzagging search pattern, scanning maybe 1,500 square miles of ocean if you generously calculated the visual detection range on both sides of the track. A Liberator flying at 180 miles per hour at 2,000 feet altitude could visually scan a corridor roughly 20 miles wide, 10 miles to each side of the aircraft. 16 hours of flight time equaled 2,880 miles traveled, times 20 miles width equals 57,600 square miles surveyed, nearly 40 times the coverage of a surfaced U-boat. And that was visual search alone. The ASV radar added another dimension, detecting surface submarines at ranges up to 30 miles under optimal conditions. But the ocean is incomprehensibly large. The North Atlantic convoy routes spanned roughly 3,000 miles east-west and 1,000 miles north-south. 3 million square miles of operational area. One Liberator, covering 57,000 square miles per sortie, would need 52 sorties to sweep the entire zone once. And by the time you finished the 52nd sortie, the U-boats from Sortie 1 had moved. Coastal Command flew approximately 4,100 sorties in March 1943 across all patrol areas. Sounds like saturation coverage until you calculate the statistics. 4,100 sorties times 57,000 square miles equals 233 million square miles of cumulative search area. But most of that was redundant overlap, flying the same routes repeatedly. The actual effective coverage, accounting for gaps and timing, was maybe 30% of the operational zone on any given day. Still enormous. Still not enough to guarantee finding every submarine. Tim understood this geometry instinctively. On March 18th, he wrote, "The ocean is now the enemy's domain. We detect their aircraft by radar warning before they see us. We dive, we hide, we wait. Then we surface and resume patrol, knowing they may return at any moment. The initiative has shifted. We are no longer hunters. We are prey, attempting to ambush our pursuers." His boat carried a Metox radar detector, a French-designed device that picked up the emissions from Allied ASV radar sets. When the detector's alarm sounded, a buzzing tone the crews called the Biscay Cross because it was first used to detect British patrols over the Bay of Biscay. The standard procedure was immediate crash dive. No questions, no verification, just down. The system worked, mostly. Metox could detect radar pulses at ranges of 30 to 40 miles, giving the U-boat several minutes warning before the aircraft closed to visual or radar detection range. But it wasn't foolproof. The detector was prone to false alarms from atmospheric interference, and aircraft approaching from certain angles, particularly dead ahead or astern, sometimes evaded the detector's coverage pattern. Bullock's logbook from March 18th records something Tim would never know about, a contact that almost happened. At 14:20 hours, roughly 250 miles southwest of Iceland, the radar operator called out a faint surface return at 11 miles, bearing 270 degrees. Bullock altered course to investigate. By the time the Liberator reached the contact coordinates 3 minutes later, the surface was empty. No U-boat, no wake, nothing. Bullock circled the area for 20 minutes, dropping sonobuoys, experimental acoustic listening devices that radioed back underwater sounds, but detected nothing. His after-action report concluded, possible U-boat contact. Target dove before visual acquisition. No attack conducted. He marked the position on the patrol chart with a red pencil and continued the flight. The contact might have been U-632, a different Type 9 that was operating in that area and reported diving from aircraft attack on March 18th. Or it might have been a whale. The distinction mattered enormously to the submarine crew if it was U-632, and not at all if it was marine life. Bullock had no way of knowing. The technical specifications tell the story more clearly than tactics or courage. A B-24 Liberator cost approximately $250,000 in 1943 U.S. currency. A Type 9 D-2 U-boat cost 6.2 million Reichsmarks, roughly $2.5 million at wartime exchange rates. One Liberator cost 1/10 the price of the submarine it hunted, yet provided 10 times the search coverage per day. The economics were devastating for Germany. Britain and America could afford to build hundreds of long-range patrol aircraft and fly them continuously. Germany could build dozens of submarines per month, but couldn't cover enough ocean with them to ensure regular convoy interceptions. What strikes me as almost elegant, in a terrible way, is how the geometry favored the defender. The convoys only needed to avoid U-boats. The U-boats needed to find convoys in 3 million square miles of ocean, find them while evading air patrols, coordinate attacks via radio that gave away their positions, and accomplish all this while operating machines that broke down constantly and required weeks of transit time just to reach the operational area. By spring 1943, Coastal Command had refined its tactics to exploit this geometric advantage. Rather than patrolling randomly, aircraft were concentrated along known U-boat transit routes, the Iceland-Faroes Gap, the Bay of Biscay, the approaches to convoy lanes reported by intelligence. The goal wasn't necessarily to sink submarines, though that was welcome. The goal was denial, force U-boats to dive and stay submerged, reducing their speed to 3 or 4 knots and their search radius to nearly 0. A wolf pack needed to maintain a visual patrol line on the surface, with boats spaced 15 or 20 miles apart, sweeping a corridor 150 miles wide to intercept convoys. If aircraft forced that patrol line underwater, the corridor collapsed. Convoys passed through undetected. Dönitz's war diary from March and April 1943 is filled with frustrated entries noting this phenomenon. Wolfpack Group Raubgraf positioned optimally in expected convoy route. Air activity forced prolonged submergence. Convoy passed undetected during hours underwater. The VLR Liberators had another advantage beyond search radius. Endurance allowed them to loiter. If a U-boat was detected and dove, a short-range aircraft would have to break off and return to base before the submarine resurfaced. A Liberator could circle the area for hours, waiting. Tim's war diary from late March describes an encounter where U-251 was forced down by a Liberator and remained submerged for 6 hours while the aircraft orbited overhead, occasionally dropping sonobuoys to check if the boat was still present. Eventually, the Liberator departed, fuel exhausted, but by then the convoy U-251 had been shadowing, was 40 miles away and beyond pursuit. No attack, no sinking, just denial. The sortie was listed in Tim's log as unsuccessful due to air interdiction. It was one of 43 such aborted attacks documented in March 1943 BDU records. Dönitz's operational summaries claim only 12 aborts due to aircraft. Allied Air Patrol logs document 43 confirmed disruptions. The discrepancy suggests either incomplete German record-keeping or a reluctance to admit how often air power was neutralizing submarine operations. There's a reconnaissance photograph in the RAF archives from Bullock's squadron that encapsulates the futility for me. It shows the North Atlantic on March 17th, shot from 8,000 feet. Just gray water extending to the horizon in every direction. Small whitecaps visible as texture, but no ships, no submarines, no landmarks. In the lower right corner, there's a tiny white smudge that might be a periscope wake or might be natural sea foam. Bullock wrote on the back, "Probably a whale. Didn't waste the depth charge. The ocean is vast and indifferent." Aircraft and submarines both operated inside that vastness, occasionally glimpsing each other, more often seeing nothing at all. But the aircraft could search vastly more space in the same amount of time, and there were more aircraft than submarines. The geometry dictated the outcome. Germany had built machines optimized for endurance, submarines that could patrol for months, cross entire oceans, reach distant waters. Britain built machines optimized for coverage, aircraft that could sweep enormous areas daily, deny sea space to the enemy, tip the tactical balance through sheer presence. Endurance lost to coverage. The whale, however magnificent, couldn't hide from the swarm of mosquitoes. Chapter 8. Black May. The 1st of May 1943, and the war was entering its 45th month. In the operations room at BDU headquarters in Berlin, Dönitz had relocated from France to the German capital in March. The morning situation report tallied 42 U-boats converging on convoy ONS-5, a slow eastbound convoy of 43 merchant ships struggling through heavy weather south of Greenland. The intelligence was good. B-Dienst had broken the British convoy cipher and provided accurate position reports. The weather was cooperating. Fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft, leaving the convoy vulnerable. The tactical setup appeared optimal. 42 submarines against 43 targets, with only 6 escort vessels defending them. Dönitz's war diary entry from May 1st projects confidence. Group Star and Group Fink are in excellent position. Anticipate decisive engagement within 24 hours. This convoy presents the opportunity to demonstrate sustained pressure despite recent setbacks. The recent setbacks were politely understated. April had been brutal. 15 U-boats sunk. But May would be worse. Funkmatt Werner Henke, the radio operator aboard U-515, kept a personal log of signal traffic during the ONS-5 battle that provides a different perspective than official reports. Henke's role was to monitor the radio frequencies constantly, receiving tactical orders from BDU and relaying contact reports from his boat to headquarters and other submarines in the pack. The log for May 4th and 5th shows the communication network beginning to fray under pressure. 0217 hours, May 4th. Contact report from U-658. Convoy spotted. Transmitting position. 0241. BDU orders 17 boats to converge on the coordinates. 0305. U-192 reports aircraft contact. Forced to dive. 0338. U-638 reports torpedo hits, 2 ships sinking. Then the entries become more fragmented. 0452. U-531 transmits partial message, convoy ONS 5 attacked, stop. Aircraft, stop. Am diving, am dot, and the signal ends. Henke noted, transmission ceased mid-word. No further contact with 531. Presumed sunk. The convoy battle lasted 4 days, May 4th through 7th, and the tactical details are preserved in overlapping records from both sides. BDU War Diary, individual U-boat logs, British Escort Group reports, Admiralty tracking summaries. 13 merchant ships were sunk, totaling approximately 62,000 tons, a significant local victory for the Wolfpack, but the cost was catastrophic. 7 U-boats confirmed destroyed during the battle. U-192, U-125, U-531, U-638, U-438, U-658, and U-209. 3 more damaged severely enough to abort patrol and return to port, effectively mission kills. The exchange ratio had inverted. For every 2 merchant ships sunk, 1 U-boat was destroyed, and the pace of loss was accelerating in ways that overwhelmed BDU's ability to coordinate. What collapsed during ONS-5 wasn't tactics or courage, it was command and control. The Wolfpack doctrine depended on coordinated attacks directed by shore-based headquarters. Boats would report convoy positions, BDU would vector additional submarines toward the contact, and the pack would mass for a simultaneous assault that overwhelmed escorts. But coordination required radio communication, and radio communication gave away positions to HF/DF stations and drew aircraft and escort groups directly to the transmitting boats. Henke's signal log shows this death spiral clearly. May 5th, between 0600 and 1200 hours, 23 separate boats transmitted contact reports, position updates, or requests for tactical guidance. Each transmission was brief, 30 to 90 seconds, but each was detected. By noon, the Operational Intelligence Center in London had DF fixes on 18 submarines in a 40-mile radius around ONS-5. The convoy escort commander, Commander Peter Gretton, aboard HMS Duncan, had access to these fixes via encrypted radio from the Admiralty. He knew where the U-boats were with greater precision than the U-boats knew where each other were. The escorts had another advantage: support groups. These were dedicated hunter-killer formations, destroyers and frigates not tied to specific convoys, but roaming independently, responding to U-boat concentrations. When ONS-5 came under attack, 2 support groups converged on the area within 18 hours. Instead of 6 escorts defending 43 merchants, there were suddenly 14 warships saturating a relatively small patch of ocean with ASDIC, radar, and aggressive patrolling. The U-boats found themselves hunted in the same waters where they were trying to hunt. U-192 was caught on the surface by HMS Vedette at dawn on May 6th and destroyed by gunfire before it could dive. U-638 was depth-charged to destruction by a coordinated attack from 3 corvettes that had triangulated its position using HF/DF. The after-action report from HMS Loosestrife describes the kill clinically. Obtained firm ASDIC contact at 1,200 yards. Attacked with 14 charge patterns set to depths of 50, 150, and 300 feet. Heavy underwater explosion followed by debris and oil surfacing. Assessed as kill. Dönitz received fragmentary reports throughout the battle and attempted to maintain tactical control, but the information arriving at BDU was incomplete and contradictory. U-boats reported sinking ships that were actually damaged, but still afloat. They reported evading aircraft that had in fact sunk other boats nearby. The operational fog was thickening. On May 6th, Dönitz ordered additional boats to reinforce the attack, pulling submarines from other patrol areas. By May 7th, 31 U-boats were engaged in or moving toward ONS-5, and the losses continued. U-438 sunk by HMS Pelican. U-125 depth-charged by HMS Oribe. Each loss represented 43 or 44 crew killed, 900 tons of submarine eliminated, months of training and construction gone in seconds. The battle was becoming a slaughter. May 12th, and Dönitz's war diary shows the first cracks in his confidence. The entry reads, "Boat losses this month, 37. This is unsustainable. Operational effectiveness of Wolfpack tactics is degrading under combined pressure of air and surface escorts. Enemy has achieved local superiority in all domains: numbers, coordination, technology. Continuation of current operational tempo will exhaust the force within weeks. He didn't share this assessment with Berlin. The official BDU communiqué from May 12 claims, "Intense convoy battles demonstrate U-boat force remains capable of inflicting significant losses despite increased enemy defenses." But privately, Dönitz was calculating survival rates. In March 1943, Germany lost 15 U-boats. April, 15. May was on track to exceed 40 losses, more than one per day. At current production rates of roughly 30 new boats per month, the force was shrinking in absolute terms, and the new crews were increasingly inexperienced. Training cycles had been compressed from 9 months to 5 months due to manpower shortages. Green crews made mistakes, navigational errors, torpedo malfunctions, slow response to aircraft contacts. Mistakes that would have been survivable in 1940 or 41 were fatal in 1943. On May 22nd, Dönitz convened a conference with his senior staff at BDU headquarters. The meeting notes, preserved in German military archives, show a tense discussion about whether to continue North Atlantic operations or withdraw temporarily to regroup. Contra-Admiral Eberhard Gott, Chief of Operations, argued for withdrawal. Current loss rates are approximately 40% per month. If sustained, the entire operational force will be eliminated within 3 months. We must suspend operations, analyze failures, develop countermeasures. Dönitz resisted initially, arguing that withdrawing would cede the initiative and allow Allied convoys to cross unmolested. But Gott presented the numbers in a form Dönitz couldn't refute. April through May, 55 boats lost, 37 new boats commissioned, net reduction of 18 boats. June projections based on current trends, 30 boats lost, 30 boats commissioned, net zero growth. "We are consuming the force faster than we can regenerate it," Gott said. The mathematics were irrefutable. May 24th, and Dönitz drafted the order that would effectively end the first phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. The signal, transmitted to all boats operating in the North Atlantic, was brief. Cease convoy operations in area north of 45 degrees. All boats withdraw to area south of Azores. Reform for operations against Mediterranean traffic. It was phrased as a tactical redeployment, not a retreat, but everyone understood what it meant. The U-boats had been driven from the main convoy lanes. Dönitz's post-war memoir describes this as a temporary adjustment to operational focus, pending introduction of improved radar detection equipment and enhanced anti-aircraft armament. His war diary from May 24th tells a different story. The enemy has achieved air superiority and numerical superiority in surface escorts. Our losses are no longer proportional to results achieved. I see no alternative to withdrawal. This decision will be interpreted as defeat. Perhaps it is. The statistics from Black May are unambiguous. 41 U-boats sunk in 31 days, the highest monthly loss of the war to that point. Of these, 25 were sunk by surface escorts, 9 by aircraft, 7 by combined air-surface operations. German claims for May, approximately 264,000 tons of Allied shipping sunk, 58 vessels. Actual verified Allied losses, 264,852 tons, 34 ships. For once, the German tonnage figures were accurate, but the ship count was inflated, multiple boats claiming credit for the same sinking, or reporting damaged ships as sunk. But even accepting the favorable numbers, the exchange was disastrous. 41 U-boats lost, each displacing roughly 900 tons on average, equals 36,900 tons of German submarines destroyed. The Allies sank more German tonnage than Germany sank Allied tonnage. The equation had flipped. When I examine the interrogation transcripts of U-boat crew captured during May 1943, a consistent theme emerges: exhaustion and chaos. Survivors from U-456, sunk on May 27th by HMS Swale, described receiving 18 different tactical orders from BDU over a 6-hour period during a convoy engagement, many of them contradictory. First, we were ordered to maintain contact in shadow, then to attack immediately, then to withdraw to reformulate the pack, then to proceed independently if separated. We stopped paying attention to the orders and simply tried to survive. Another prisoner, from U-589, reported that his boat had been depth-charged so many times during its final patrol that the crew had become psychologically numb. After the 50th explosion, you stop reacting. You just sit there and wait to die. If the next charge kills you, fine. If it doesn't, you surface and try again. There's no fear left, just fatigue. The British didn't fully understand why May was so devastating for the U-boats. Post-battle assessments credited improved tactics, better radar, more effective depth charge patterns, all accurate but incomplete explanations. What they missed was the cumulative exhaustion of the German submarine force. The crews operating in May were often on their 4th or 5th patrol, with inadequate rest between voyages. The boats themselves were wearing out, diesel engines that needed overhauls, batteries losing capacity, hull valves corroded by months of saltwater exposure. Germany's shipyard infrastructure was under sustained Allied bombing. Repair times stretched from 3 weeks to 6 weeks. Training pipelines were producing crews faster than they could be properly trained. The system was collapsing under its own operational tempo, and Black May was the visible symptom of internal rot that had been accumulating for months. Dönitz never publicly acknowledged May 1943 as a defeat. In his memoir, published in the 1950s, he frames it as a necessary operational pause to integrate new technologies and revise tactics. But the war diary entries from late May tell a different story. Doubt, frustration, awareness that something fundamental had shifted. On May 30th, he wrote, "I believe the campaign has entered a new phase, where our previous advantages no longer apply. The enemy has solved the U-boat problem through overwhelming force application. We will continue operations, but I no longer see a path to strategic victory in the Atlantic." That assessment never reached the official war logs. It remained private, filed away, a quiet admission that the arithmetic had failed. The ocean had become a graveyard, and May was the month Germany's submarine force learned it was mortal. Chapter 9. The Acoustic Torpedo. The 20th of August, 1943, and at the Eckernförde torpedo testing facility on the Baltic coast, engineers were conducting final trials on a weapon that Dönitz believed might restore the initiative his boats had lost during Black May. The device was designated T5 Zaunkönig, Wren in English, though the Allies would come to call it the Gnat for German Naval Acoustic Torpedo. A grainy photograph from the test facility shows the torpedo's guidance section, a circular assembly roughly the size of a dinner plate, packed with hydrophones and primitive analog circuitry. Someone had attached a handwritten tag to the assembly. Listening radius, 300 meters. Effective range, 5,700 meters. Target acquisition, propeller cavitation in 400 to 500 Hz frequency band. Below that, in different handwriting, a margin note. But the ocean is full of noise. The T5 was Germany's response to an increasingly deadly problem. Escorts had become too aggressive to evade. In 1940 and 41, a U-boat could surface at night, line up a shot, fire conventional torpedoes at merchant ships, and submerge before escorts arrived. By 1943, escorts charged toward any surface submarine with such speed that the boat rarely had time to properly aim at the convoy. And when a U-boat tried to fire at merchantmen, the escorts would close in, forcing the boat to dive defensively or risk being rammed and sunk. The T5 was designed to reverse this dynamic. It homed on the sound of a ship's propellers, specifically targeting the high-speed propeller cavitation produced by destroyers and corvettes sprinting at 20 knots. The theory was elegant. Fire the torpedo at an approaching escort, let the acoustic seeker guide itself to the target, kill the hunter instead of the prey. With escorts sunk or damaged, the U-boat could attack the convoy at leisure. The technical specifications were impressive for 1943 technology. The T5 carried a 280-kilogram warhead, smaller than conventional torpedoes to accommodate the guidance system. It ran at 24.5 knots, slower than conventional models but fast enough to chase most surface ships. The acoustic seeker consisted of 4 hydrophones arranged around the torpedo's nose, connected to a mechanical steering mechanism that analyzed which hydrophone detected the loudest signal and adjusted the rudder to steer toward that sound source. Maximum effective range was 5,700 meters in ideal conditions, though realistic engagement ranges were closer to 3,000 meters due to ocean ambient noise. The seeker activated automatically 1,500 meters after launch, giving the torpedo time to clear the firing submarine's own propeller noise before going active. Once locked onto a target, the torpedo would chase the loudest sound within a 12-degree cone, correcting its course continuously until impact or fuel exhaustion. The first combat deployment came on September 20th, 1943. Oberleutnant zur See Paul Friedrich Otto, commanding U-270, fired a T-5 at HMS Lagan, a corvette that was depth-charging another submarine during Convoy ON-202. Otto's war diary records the event with clinical precision. 1647 hours. Corvette closing at estimated 22 knots, range 1,800 meters. Fired one T-5 on bearing 290. Torpedo ran true. After 98 seconds, observed explosion at target position. Corvette stopped, appeared to settle by stern, assessed as kill. Lagan did indeed sink, the first confirmed victim of the acoustic torpedo. But post-war analysis complicates Otto's report. British damage assessment concluded that the torpedo actually detonated under Lagan due to a depth-setting error. The warhead went off at 30 feet instead of making contact with the hull. The explosion broke the ship's keel, but it was a near miss that functioned as a kill, not the perfect hit Otto described. The distinction mattered because it revealed a weakness. The T-5's depth keeping was unreliable. By October, BDU had distributed approximately 200 T-5s to operational boats, with orders to use them exclusively against escorts. Dönitz's operational directive from October 5th emphasizes this. Zaunkönig torpedoes are not to be wasted on merchant vessels. They are precision weapons for eliminating screening forces. Once escorts are neutralized, conventional torpedoes may be used against convoy shipping. The early results seemed promising. October sinking claims included 9 escorts destroyed by T-5 attacks. But when Allied records were cross-referenced after the war, the actual total was 7 confirmed sinkings. 2 of the claims were cases where multiple U-boats fired at the same target, and both claimed credit. Still, 7 escorts in 1 month was significant. The escorts represented roughly 28,000 tons total, and more importantly, they were force multipliers. Each escort protected dozens of merchant ships. Removing them from the equation should have opened convoys to attack, but the British adapted with startling speed. By late October, escort groups were deploying a device called Foxer, a towed noisemaker that created propeller-like sounds louder than the actual ship's propellers. The device was primitive, essentially a pair of metal bars that clattered together when pulled through the water at high speed, creating cavitation and vibration that mimicked a ship's screws. When towed 50 yards behind an escort, Foxer presented a louder acoustic target than the ship itself. T-5 torpedoes, programmed to chase the loudest sound, locked onto the noisemaker and detonated harmlessly astern. The first documented instance of Foxer defeating a T-5 attack was November 3rd, during Convoy ON-207. U-848 fired 3 acoustic torpedoes at a destroyer. All 3 tracked to the Foxer decoy and exploded 80 yards behind the ship. The destroyer, undamaged, turned and sank U-848 with depth charges. Korvettenkapitan Peter Kramer, commanding U-333, described the acoustic torpedo's declining effectiveness in his memoir, written decades after the war. On November 17th, during an attack on convoy SL-139, Kramer fired 2 T-5s at separate escorts. The first detonated on a Foxer decoy. The second appeared to track correctly, but exploded prematurely, possibly a faulty pistol, possibly detonation, triggered by the intense propeller noise overwhelming the seeker's guidance logic. Kramer wrote, "The wonder weapon is now a liability. We've lost the element of surprise. The enemy has developed a simple countermeasure that costs them almost nothing and renders our expensive technological achievement worthless. We gained perhaps 6 weeks of effectiveness, then nothing." His frustration is evident in the phrasing. The T-5 had been oversold internally as a campaign-changing innovation, and its rapid obsolescence was demoralizing. The statistics bear out Kramer's assessment. September through December 1943, T-5 torpedoes sank 22 Allied escorts, destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, totaling approximately 28,000 tons. Sounds significant until you realize that escorts weren't the tonnage target. The entire strategic purpose of the U-boat campaign was to sink merchant shipping, not warships. An escort displaced maybe 1,200 tons on average. A loaded Liberty ship displaced 10,000 tons. From a pure tonnage perspective, sinking escorts was strategically inefficient. The T-5 success rate also declined precipitously once Foxer became standard equipment. September, 9 escorts sunk. October, 7. November, 4. December, 2. By January 1944, T-5 effectiveness had dropped below 12%. That is, only 1 in 8 acoustic torpedoes fired resulted in a hit. Conventional torpedoes, for comparison, maintained roughly 18 to 20% hit rates throughout this period. The acoustic torpedo had become less effective than the weapons it was designed to replace. What strikes me as almost tragic about the T-5 program is the misallocation of engineering effort. Germany invested substantial resources into developing a sophisticated homing torpedo, optimized for killing escorts when the campaign's objective was merchant tonnage. It's a solution to the wrong problem. The escorts were a means to an end. They protected the convoys. Killing escorts only mattered if doing so allowed subsequent attacks on merchantmen. But by late 1943, even when T-5 successfully sank an escort, the remaining screening forces were sufficient to defend the convoy. The tactical equation had shifted. A convoy with 6 escorts could lose 1 to an acoustic torpedo and still have 5 remaining, enough to maintain protective coverage. Meanwhile, the U-boat that fired the T-5 had expended a torpedo, revealed its position, and now faced depth charging from the surviving escorts. The exchange wasn't favorable. There's a technical detail about the T-5 that I find revealing about late-war German weapons development. The acoustic seeker was partially based on technology captured from Soviet submarines during the 1941 invasion. Leningrad had submarine research facilities that the Germans overran, and among the salvaged documents were designs for acoustic homing systems the Soviets had been developing but never deployed. Germany's innovation was partly reverse engineering someone else's experimental prototypes. This doesn't diminish the engineering achievement. Making a functional acoustic guidance system with 1943 electronics was genuinely difficult, but it complicates the narrative of German technological superiority. They weren't inventing from scratch. They were adapting existing concepts under intense pressure to produce something, anything, that might tilt the balance. By March 1944, BDU quietly downgraded the T-5 from priority weapon to supplementary armament. New U-boats still carried a few acoustic torpedoes, but the emphasis shifted back to conventional attacks. Dönitz's war diary from March 12 notes, "Zaunkönig has not achieved anticipated strategic effect. Escort losses, while satisfactory, have not translated into increased merchant sinkings. Enemy convoy routing and escort allocation have compensated for acoustic torpedo threat. Recommend continued production at reduced priority, pending development of improved guidance systems." The improved systems never materialized. By late 1944, most U-boats carried 1 or 2 T-5s as last resort defensive weapons against pursuing destroyers, but the primary armament remained conventional G7 torpedoes. The T-5 episode encapsulates a recurring pattern in Germany's late-war Atlantic campaign. Tactical innovation, deployed to solve strategic problems that couldn't be fixed tactically. The real issue wasn't that escorts were too hard to sink. It was that Allied industrial production had created numerical superiority so vast that trading torpedoes for escorts was unsustainable. By late 1943, Britain and America were commissioning new destroyers and corvettes faster than Germany could sink them. Even if every T-5 fired had achieved a kill, it wouldn't have mattered strategically. The convoy system would have adapted, as it did to every other threat, through redundancy and overwhelming numbers. The ocean was too large, the Allies too numerous, and the arithmetic too unfavorable. A better mousetrap doesn't help when you're outnumbered 40 to 1 by mice. Chapter 10. The Biscay Slaughter. The 1st of June, 1943, and Squadron Leader Wilfred Olton was reviewing the previous month's patrol summaries at RAF Coastal Command's No. 502 Squadron Base in southwest England. The squadron flew Wellington bombers, twin-engine aircraft that were obsolescent for strategic bombing, but still effective in the anti-submarine role. Olton's operational analysis, preserved in the squadron's records, noted a stark pattern. During May, 502 Squadron had flown 317 sorties over the Bay of Biscay, attacked 37 U-boats and sunk or severely damaged 19. The kill rate, 1 U-boat per 16.7 sorties, was extraordinary compared to mid-ocean patrols, where aircraft might fly 100 sorties between contacts. The reason was simple geography. German U-boats based in French Atlantic ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux, had to cross the Bay of Biscay to reach the open ocean hunting grounds. The bay was roughly 300 miles wide and 400 miles north to south, relatively shallow water and absolutely unavoidable. Every boat departing France had to transit this choke point, and Coastal Command was waiting. The strategic value of the French ports had reversed since 1940. When France fell and Germany gained access to Atlantic bases, it seemed like an enormous advantage. U-boats saved 900 miles of round-trip transit distance compared to sailing from Germany. But by mid-1943, those bases had become a trap. The boats had to cross Biscay twice per patrol, outbound and inbound. Allied aircraft could concentrate patrols over a relatively small area, with near certainty of making contacts. The geography that had been an asset became a killing zone. Dönitz understood this. On June 1st, he issued a tactical directive that would prove disastrous. U-boats were ordered to cross the Bay of Biscay in groups of 4 or 5 boats, remaining surfaced, with combined anti-aircraft firepower to fight their way through the air patrols. The logic was that a single U-boat caught on the surface by an aircraft had no chance. The boat would crash dive, and the aircraft would attack during the 45 seconds it took to submerge. But 4 or 5 boats together could mass 20 to 25 anti-aircraft guns, 20mm cannons and 37mm flak guns, enough to damage or drive off an attacking bomber. In theory, the first major test of this doctrine came on July 12th. U-435 and U-558 were crossing Biscay together, about 60 miles northwest of Cape Ortegal on the Spanish coast, both boats on the surface in broad daylight. Olten's Wellington spotted them at 11 miles, approaching from the sun to minimize visual detection. The standard attack profile for an armed surfaced U-boat was a shallow glide from 1,500 feet, release depth charges at 50 feet above the water, then immediately climb and turn away to avoid flying through the explosion plume. But with 2 boats, Olten had to choose a target and ignore the other, accepting that the second boat would have free shots at his aircraft. He chose U-558, the southernmost boat. The attack run lasted 38 seconds from the moment the U-boat lookout spotted the aircraft until the depth charges hit the water. In that time, both submarines opened fire. Olten's after-action report describes seeing tracer rounds arcing up toward the Wellington, then feeling impacts as 20mm shells punched through the fuselage. The aircraft lost hydraulics, and the starboard engine began trailing smoke. But the depth charges fell in a perfect straddle across U-558's hull. The boat lifted partly out of the water from the explosion's concussion, rolled onto its beam ends, and sank bow first in less than 3 minutes. Olten coaxed the damaged Wellington back to base, landing on one engine with manual gear extension. U-435, damaged but functional, aborted its patrol and returned to Brest. The exchange: 1 bomber damaged, recoverable; 1 U-boat destroyed, 43 crew killed. Dönitz's fight-through policy lasted roughly 7 weeks and cost him dearly. June through August 1943, 28 U-boats sunk in the Bay of Biscay, not including boats that were damaged and forced to abort patrols. The sinkings were distributed across the summer: 4 in June, 19 in July, 5 in August, with July representing the peak of carnage. The boats were overwhelmingly caught on the surface during daylight transits. Aircraft from RAF Coastal Command, the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 10 Squadron, and even USAAF B-24 Liberators from the 19th Anti-Submarine Squadron hunted the bay methodically. The British introduced a new tactic called swamping, multiple aircraft patrolling overlapping sectors, so that if one made contact and engaged, others could converge on the position within minutes. U-boats fighting off one aircraft would be attacked by a second, then a third, until anti-aircraft ammunition was exhausted, or the boat suffered enough damage to force a dive. On July 30th, U-462, a Type 14 supply submarine called a milk cow because it carried fuel and supplies to resupply other boats, was caught by a Wellington from No. 17-2 Squadron and sunk with all hands. U-462 displaced 1,900 tons and carried 400 tons of diesel fuel, 14 torpedoes, and food for 40 days' worth of resupply operations. Her loss was operationally devastating. Dönitz's war diary from July 31st calculates the ripple effect. Loss of U-462 eliminates resupply capability for Central Atlantic operations. Boats currently on extended patrols must return to port prematurely for refueling. Estimate 10 fewer combat patrols achievable this quarter due to loss of this single boat. 1 submarine sunk, 10 patrols canceled. The force multiplier was painful. August brought the Lee Light, a searchlight system mounted on Liberator bombers that allowed night attacks. The device was a retractable 22 million candle power lamp installed under the aircraft's wing. The tactic: patrol at night using radar to detect surfaced U-boats, close to within a mile, descend to attack altitude, then activate the Lee Light at the last moment, illuminating the target and allowing visual bomb aiming in total darkness. U-106 was caught by this method on the night of August 2nd. The boat was transiting on the surface under cover of darkness, supposedly safe from air attack, when a Lee Light-equipped Liberator from No. 19 Squadron appeared overhead and bathed it in blinding white light. The crew, adapted to night vision, were instantly blinded. The boat crash-dived, but not fast enough. Depth charges bracketed the swirl where U-106 had disappeared, and a massive underwater explosion marked the kill. Survivors from the crew, captured during post-battle search and rescue, described the Lee Light as psychologically devastating. You cannot fight what you cannot see. The light comes from nowhere, blinding, and then the bombs fall. There is no warning, no chance to respond. The casualty statistics forced Dönitz to abandon the surface transit policy by early September. On September 4th, BDU issued revised orders. All U-boats were to cross the Bay of Biscay, submerged at night, surfacing only briefly to recharge batteries, with strict radar watch maintained at all times. This was tactically safer, but operationally crippling. A Type 7 U-boat could make 17 knots on the surface, but only 7.6 knots submerged. Transit time across Biscay increased from roughly 2 days to 8 days. Patrol duration in the operational area decreased proportionally. A boat that previously spent 21 days hunting in the mid-Atlantic now spent only 13 days hunting and 16 days in transit. Operational efficiency collapsed. When I cross-reference the Biscay loss statistics with the overall U-boat campaign metrics, the strategic impact becomes clear. June through August 1943, 28 boats sunk in Biscay, average displacement 900 tons per boat, equals 25,200 tons of German submarines destroyed before they could engage enemy shipping. During the same period, total Allied merchant shipping losses in all theaters, approximately 680,000 tons. The Germans were losing U-boat tonnage at a rate equivalent to roughly 4% of the merchant tonnage they were sinking. Put differently, for every 25 merchant ships sunk, Germany lost 1 submarine in Biscay alone, not counting boats lost during actual convoy attacks. The attrition was unsustainable. There's an intelligence dimension that often gets overlooked. German signals intelligence, the B-Dienst, had successfully penetrated some Allied aircraft patrol schedules by intercepting and decrypting RAF administrative radio traffic. BDU attempted to route U-boats through Biscay during gaps in the patrol pattern, times when aircraft were refueling or changing shifts. This worked approximately 40% of the time, but 1 intercept failure equaled 1 dead submarine. The margin was too thin, and the British were refining their own patrol schedules based on U-boat transit patterns gleaned from HF/DF fixes and Enigma decrypts, creating a feedback loop where both sides were trying to predict the other's movements. The Germans usually lost this chess match because they had fewer aircraft to evade than the British had patrol planes to deploy. Squadron Leader Olton's sortie log from July 19th includes a photograph that summarizes the period for me. It shows a U-boat, type unknown, possibly a Type 9, on the surface in heavy seas, clearly attempting to crash dive. The conning tower is just visible above the waves, and you can see crew members scrambling down the hatch. The photo was taken from 1,500 feet, as Olton's Wellington was beginning its attack run. Written on the back, contact bearing 273 degrees, range 3 miles, attacked with 6 depth charges, assessed probable kill, heavy oil slick observed, No survivors cited. The bureaucratic language obscures the violence. In the photograph, those men climbing down the hatch had maybe 30 seconds to live. They couldn't see the aircraft yet. It's approaching from behind and above, out of their field of view. They're following procedure, diving to safety, unaware that the depth charges are already falling. The Bay of Biscay became a metaphor for Germany's entire strategic predicament in the Atlantic. The French bases, once an asset, were now a geographic liability that concentrated U-boats into a predictable kill zone. The fight-through doctrine, intended to restore offensive initiative, instead accelerated losses. The submarine force was trapped in a tactical cul-de-sac. Surface transits meant air attacks. Submerged transits meant reduced operational time, and there was no third option. Dönitz never seriously considered relocating U-boat bases to Norway, where transit routes avoided the Biscay choke point, because the logistics of relocating maintenance facilities, supply depots, and trained personnel were prohibitive. So the boats kept crossing the bay, month after month, and the aircraft kept hunting them. By late 1943, experienced U-boat crews referred to the Biscay transit as running the gauntlet. The ocean had become a highway, and highways have ambush points. Chapter 11. The Liberty Ship's Revenge. The 27th of September, 1942, and at the Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California, a crowd of several hundred workers and Navy officials gathered to witness something that shipbuilding experts had privately considered impossible. A Liberty ship, hull number 501, designated SS Robert E. Peary, was about to be launched exactly 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after her keel had been laid. Welder Inez Sauer stood near the bow, wearing coveralls, still smudged with welding spatter, watching the launch cradle being prepared. Sauer had worked on the Peary's forward hull sections for 72 consecutive hours during the final push, part of a 3-shift rotation that kept welding torches lit around the clock. In an oral history recorded decades later, she described Liberty ships as ugly but fast to build. We weren't making art, we were making volume. The Peary slid down the ways at 1400 hours to the sound of air horns and cheering. 4 days from keel to launch. The record stood for the entire war. The Liberty ship program was industrial warfare in its purest form. Reduce a complex product to standardized components, prefabricate everything possible, assemble on simplified production lines, and scale to volumes that overwhelm the enemy's capacity to destroy them. The design was deliberately crude. 441 feet long, 57 feet wide, displacing approximately 10,000 tons when fully loaded. A single 3-cylinder reciprocating steam engine producing 2,500 horsepower, driving the ship at a maximum speed of 11 knots, slower than most modern cargo vessels, but adequate for convoy work. The hull was welded, not riveted, which saved enormous labor time but created structural vulnerabilities. Early Liberty ships had a disturbing tendency to develop cracks in rough seas, occasionally breaking apart catastrophically when waves stressed the welded seams beyond tolerance. But even accounting for these failures, the ships were cost-effective. Construction cost, $1.8 million per vessel. Time to build, 30 to 40 days on average, with some yards achieving sub-20-day construction times by mid-1943. The mathematics were overwhelming. In 1942, American shipyards delivered roughly 8 million deadweight tons of new merchant shipping, approximately 700 ships. German U-boats sank roughly 6.2 million tons that same year, about 1,000 ships across all Allied nations. For the first time since the war began, construction exceeded losses. Not by much, only 1,800,000 tons net gain. But the trend had reversed. In 1943, the gap widened dramatically. American production, 19.2 million tons. U-boat sinkings, 3.1 million tons globally, a 6-to-1 production advantage. By 1944, the ratio would approach 10-to-1. Germany wasn't just losing the tonnage war, it was being buried by an industrial avalanche. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who pioneered the Liberty ship program, understood something the Germans apparently didn't. In a production war, speed and volume matter more than quality or sophistication. His shipyards used modular construction. Hull sections, engine rooms, deck houses, bow and stern assemblies were all built separately in warehouses, then transported to the shipway and welded together like assembling a giant 3-dimensional puzzle. This allowed parallel workflows. While one ship was being assembled on the slipway, components for the next 3 ships were being fabricated simultaneously in different buildings. The production rhythm was relentless. Richmond Shipyard No. 2 alone delivered 747 ships between 1942 and 1945, roughly 1 ship every 2 days for 3 years straight. Sauer's account describes the human dimension of this industrial machine. Workers were recruited from across the country, many of them women entering manufacturing jobs for the first time. Training was minimal, 2 weeks of classroom instruction, then on-the-job learning under experienced welders. The work was dangerous, welding in confined spaces, working at height on scaffolding, handling heavy steel plate with inadequate safety equipment. Injuries were common, but the wages were good by wartime standards, and the sense of purpose was powerful. Sauer remembered thinking, as she watched the Peary launch, that somewhere in the Atlantic, a U-boat might sink this exact ship in 3 months. But we'd build 2 more to replace it, she said. That's what the Germans didn't understand. They couldn't sink ships faster than we could weld them. The technical innovation that made Liberty ships possible was electric arc welding at scale. Riveting a hull, the traditional method, required drilling thousands of holes, heating rivets to red-hot temperature, hammering them into place while hot, and filing the heads smooth. Labor-intensive and time-consuming. A riveted Liberty ship hull would have required approximately 200,000 rivets, each taking 5 to 10 minutes to install properly. Call it 16,000 to 33,000 labor hours just for riveting. Welding the same hull required approximately 1,500 linear feet of seams, with modern welding equipment covering about 2 feet per hour. That's 750 labor hours, roughly 22 times faster than riveting. The quality was lower. Welded seams were prone to cracking under stress, and cold water could make the steel brittle. But the speed advantage was decisive. The structural failures were real and sometimes catastrophic. In January 1943, SS Schenectady, a T-2 tanker built using welding techniques similar to Liberty ships, literally broke in half while docked in calm water at Portland, Oregon. The ship's hull fractured amidships, probably due to brittle fracture propagation in cold water, combined with residual stress from welding. Metallurgical analysis after the war determined that the steel used in early Liberty ships had insufficient fracture toughness at low temperatures, a property that wasn't well understood in 1942. The Navy responded by modifying designs to include crack arresters, structural reinforcements that prevented fractures from propagating across the entire hull. But even with these failures, Liberty ships were cheaper to replace than they were to build perfectly. If 30% of Liberty ships developed structural problems and needed repairs or were lost to hull failure, that still left 70% operational. And production was fast enough that the Navy could afford the losses. By November 1942, a critical threshold was crossed. Monthly U.S. merchant ship production exceeded monthly global Allied losses to all causes: submarines, mines, surface raiders, aircraft. November 1942 production. Approximately 140 ships launched, totaling roughly 1.2 million deadweight tons. November losses. Approximately 119 ships sunk, totaling approximately 750,000 tons. Net gain, 450,000 tons. The margin would only grow. In November 1943, American shipyards launched 140 ships, totaling 1.2 million tons, while U-boats globally sank 29 Allied ships, totaling 141,000 tons, an 8.5 to 1 production advantage. When I cross-reference monthly U-boat construction figures with Liberty ship production, the asymmetry is stark. Peak German U-boat construction, approximately 30 boats per month in mid-1943, totaling maybe 27,000 tons of submarine displacement. Peak American Liberty ship production, approximately 120 ships per month, totaling roughly 1.2 million tons dead weight. Germany was building submarines 44 times slower than America was building merchant ships. The tonnage war was arithmetically impossible to win from the moment American production reached full scale. There's an economic dimension worth noting. Liberty ships were designed to be expendable. Their expected service life was 5 years, far shorter than traditional merchant vessels, built for 20 or 30 years of peacetime operation. The ships used cheap materials, simplified machinery, and minimal amenities. Crews hated them. They were uncomfortable, prone to mechanical breakdowns, structurally questionable in heavy seas. But they floated, they carried cargo, and they could be built faster than they could be sunk. That was sufficient. Post-war, most Liberty ships were scrapped or sold to developing nations at bargain prices. A few remained in service into the 1960s and 70s, but the vast majority were gone within a decade of the war's end. They were purpose-built for a specific industrial task, outproduce the enemy's destructive capacity, and they succeeded. Dönitz was aware of Liberty ship production, but appears to have underestimated its scale. A BDU intelligence summary from March 1943 estimates American merchant ship construction at approximately 60 vessels per month, totaling 500,000 tons. The actual figure was more than double that. Where the German intelligence failure occurred isn't clear. Possibly B-Dienst intercepts of Allied shipping reports were incomplete, or possibly the estimates were deliberately lowballed to avoid demoralizing assessments. But the result was that German planning assumed a roughly 2-to-1 production advantage for the Allies, when the reality was closer to 6 or 8-to-1. Strategic decisions based on inaccurate intelligence compounded the campaign's inherent arithmetic problems. To me, the Liberty ship represents the industrialization of warfare in a form the Germans couldn't match. Germany had sophisticated engineering, Type 21 submarines with advanced battery systems, acoustic torpedoes, snorkel devices. But sophistication doesn't scale. America had crude engineering that could be replicated in dozens of shipyards simultaneously, using semi-skilled labor with standardized components. Crude at scale beats sophisticated at small volume. It's the same principle that made the T-34 tank effective for the Soviets, or the Jeep invaluable for Allied logistics. Good enough, built in overwhelming quantities, delivered continuously. The Liberty ship wasn't elegant, but by war's end, 2,700 of them had been launched. That's industrial momentum that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The ocean became a conveyor belt, and Germany couldn't blow it up fast enough to matter. Chapter 12. The Snorkel Paradox. The 14th of February, 1944, and at the Kiel Naval Dockyard, engineer Karl Dönitz, no relation to the Admiral, a coincidence that amused and annoyed him in equal measure, was supervising the retrofit installation of a snorkel device on U-264. The engineering drawings spread across his workbench showed a retractable mast, 8.5 meters tall when fully extended, with an air intake valve at the top and a diesel exhaust port at the base. The system would allow a U-boat to run its diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, drawing air through the snorkel tube instead of surfacing. In theory, this solved the submarine's greatest vulnerability. Boats could remain underwater indefinitely, recharging batteries and running life support without exposing themselves to radar or visual detection. In practice, the system was more complicated. Dönitz, the engineer, had written in the margin of the retrofit specifications, "This tube saves their lives, but we've turned submarines into slow turtles." The schnorkel, anglicized as snorkel in most histories, was a Dutch invention, captured when Germany occupied the Netherlands in 1940. The original Dutch design had been filed away and largely forgotten until mid-1943, when the catastrophic U-boat losses during Black May forced BDU to search for defensive technologies that might allow submarines to evade air attack. The snorkel was dusted off, refined, and put into production. The first operational installations began in February 1944. By May, roughly 40 boats had been retrofitted. By December, snorkels were standard equipment on all new construction and mandatory retrofits for boats returning from patrol. The technical operation was straightforward, but physically brutal for crews. The submarine would dive to periscope depth, approximately 9 meters below the surface, and extend the snorkel mast hydraulically. The diesel engines would start, drawing combustion air through the mast and exhausting fumes through a separate channel. In calm seas, the system worked acceptably. But in rough weather, waves would wash over the intake valve, triggering an automatic shutdown to prevent seawater from flooding the engines. When the valve slammed shut, the running diesels instantly created a vacuum inside the pressure hull, sucking air from the crew compartments. The pressure drop was severe, ears would pop painfully, and men working in the engine room sometimes suffered burst eardrums or sinus hemorrhages. Then the valve would reopen as the wave passed. Pressure would equalize violently, and the cycle would repeat. In heavy seas, this could happen dozens of times per hour. U-672, one of the first boats to deploy with schnorkel in March 1944, submitted a patrol report that cataloged the medical consequences. Oberleutnant Willibald Meissner, the commander, noted that after 8 hours of schnorkeling and force 6 winds, 6 crew members were hospitalized upon return to port. 2 with ruptured eardrums, 3 with severe sinus trauma, 1 with suspected lung damage from rapid pressure cycling. The boat's medical log listed chronic headaches for nearly the entire crew, attributed to carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide buildup. The diesel exhaust system was supposed to vent all fumes overboard, but in practice, small amounts of exhaust leaked into the hull through imperfect seals. Over hours of submerged running, the contamination accumulated. Crews reported nausea, disorientation, and crushing fatigue. Some commanders limited schnorkel operations to 4-hour blocks to minimize crew exposure, but this defeated the purpose. The whole point was to stay submerged continuously. The tactical implications were worse than the medical ones. A Type 7 U-boat could make 17 knots on the surface using diesel engines. Submerged on battery power, maximum speed was 7.6 knots for brief sprints, or 4 knots for sustained running. Submerged on schnorkel at periscope depth, the boat could manage maybe 5 to 6 knots maximum, and realistically 3 to 4 knots in operational conditions. The speed reduction was crippling. A Wolfpack patrol line required boats to maintain station on the surface, covering large areas and repositioning quickly when convoys were spotted. Schnorkel operations made this impossible. Boats crawled along at walking speed, unable to intercept anything faster than a slow convoy, unable to reposition effectively, unable to pursue evading targets. Worse, the schnorkel itself was detectable. The head of the mast protruded roughly 1 meter above the surface, creating a visible wake at speeds above 3 knots. Aircraft could spot this wake from 1,000 meters in good visibility, and despite German assumptions that the small radar cross-section would be invisible, Allied centimetric radar, the ASV Mark VI variant, deployed in mid-1944, could detect schnorkel masts at ranges of 8 to 12 miles under favorable conditions. What was supposed to hide U-boats now made them findable in a new way. In May 1944, HMS Starling, a sloop commanded by Captain Frederick John Walker, sank U-473 after obtaining a radar fix on the boat's schnorkel mast at 11 miles range. Walker's report described the attack as routine. Obtained radar contact, classified as probable schnorkel, closed to visual range, confirmed mast sighting. Prosecuted with depth charge attack, heavy oil and debris surfaced, assessed as kill. By June 1944, Dönitz had issued operational orders requiring all U-boats operating in British coastal waters to use schnorkel continuously, remaining submerged for the entire patrol. This was tactically defensive. Surface running in the shallow, aircraft-saturated waters around Britain was suicidal, but the cost was operational effectiveness. U-734 departed Bergen, Norway, on June 28th for a patrol in the English Channel. The boat remained submerged on schnorkel for 73 consecutive days, surfacing only twice for brief periods to repair mechanical failures. During that time, U-734 covered approximately 1,800 nautical miles, roughly 150 miles per week, and fired 0 torpedoes. No targets detected, no attacks made. The patrol was logged as operationally unsuccessful due to inability to locate enemy shipping while restricted to submerged schnorkel transit. 73 days at sea, 44 men enduring claustrophobia and carbon monoxide poisoning, for no tactical result whatsoever. The schnorkel also introduced new mechanical failure modes. The mast extension mechanism was hydraulically complex and prone to jamming, especially after depth charge near misses that bent the mast housing slightly. If the mast jammed in the extended position, the boat couldn't dive deep. Attempting to submerge past 30 meters would shear the mast off. If the mast jammed retracted, the boat couldn't run diesels and was limited to battery power, drastically reducing endurance. U-995 experienced a mast jam in the extended position during a patrol in August 1944. Faced with the choice between remaining at periscope depth, vulnerable to ramming by surface ships, or diving deep and losing the mast, the commander chose to surface and attempt manual repairs. The boat was spotted by a liberator and sunk by depth charges before repairs could be completed. What fascinates me about the schnorkel is how it succeeded at its design goal while completely failing the strategic mission. The engineering requirement was, allow U-boats to operate without surfacing, reducing vulnerability to air attack. Check. Boats equipped with snorkels could indeed remain submerged for weeks. The operational requirement was, maintain U-boat effectiveness as commerce raiders. Failed catastrophically. Snorkel-equipped boats sank far fewer ships per patrol than their surface-running predecessors, not because the torpedoes were ineffective, but because the boats couldn't find targets while crawling along at 3 knots underwater. Statistics from February through December 1944. Snorkel-equipped U-boats sank 132 ships, totaling 493,000 tons. Sounds significant until you compare it to early war rates. In 1940 alone, with far fewer U-boats operating, Germany sank approximately 471 ships, totaling 2.6 million tons. The Snorkel kept crews alive, but castrated the offensive capability. There's a morale dimension documented in BDU, Psychological Assessments from late 1944. Crew members described Snorkel patrols as being buried alive, weeks in a steel tube that smelled of diesel fumes, human waste and mildew, never seeing daylight, never feeling wind, the hull groaning from pressure changes and depth charge concussions. One psychiatrist's report, filed in September 1944, notes that some crews preferred to scuttle their boats rather than face another Snorkel patrol. The report is careful to avoid the word mutiny, but the implication is clear. Morale was collapsing under the psychological strain of prolonged submergence. Men were breaking. By December 1944, Dönitz's war diary reflects a grim acceptance. The Snorkel has succeeded in preserving the U-boat force from annihilation, but has not restored offensive capability. Boats can patrol indefinitely without being sunk, but they also accomplish little. We have created a force of survivors rather than a force of hunters. That admission never made it into official reports to the OKW. Publicly, the Snorkel was praised as a technological triumph that allowed continued operations despite Allied air superiority. Privately, it was understood as a desperation measure that traded effectiveness for survival. The boats weren't winning. They weren't even really fighting anymore. They were enduring, creeping through dark water, occasionally firing torpedoes at random targets, mostly just trying not to die. The Snorkel solved the wrong problem. The real problem wasn't how to keep U-boats alive. It was how to sink enough ships to matter strategically. And that problem had no solution by 1944. The arithmetic had spoken. The war was over, even if the submarines kept going through the motions. Chapter 13. The crew's last letter. The 10th of April 1945, and Matrosen-Gefreiter Klaus Bergen sat in the cramped crew quarters of U-546, writing what he somehow knew would be his final letter home. The boat was moored in Bergen, Norway, scheduled to depart the following morning for patrol in the North Atlantic, despite increasingly credible rumors that Germany was collapsing. Bergen's mother had saved every letter he'd sent since his assignment to the U-boat service in August 1942. 27 letters, spanning nearly 3 years and 6 patrols. The collection was published decades later in a small volume titled Fading Echoes, compiled by a German military historian who specialized in what he called the archaeology of ordinary voices. Bergen wrote in pencil on thin paper, the handwriting neat but pressed hard into the page. Mama, if you are reading this, I am gone. We all know we will not survive, but we are still leaving port. This is madness, but orders are orders. 11 days later, U-546 was sunk by the American destroyer Escort, USS Flaherty, roughly 400 miles east of Newfoundland. Bergen was 22 years old. None of the 43 crew survived. The first letter in Bergen's collection, dated August 15, 1942, reads like propaganda come to life. He'd just completed training and been assigned to U-546 as a seaman responsible for torpedo loading and basic maintenance. The tone is enthusiastic, almost naive. The ocean is beautiful. We are hunters. I am proud to serve the fatherland in the most modern branch of the Kriegsmarine. My commander says we will starve Britain within a year. I believe him. There's no irony in the text, no hint that Bergen understood the strategic realities. He was 19, had grown up in a small village near Frankfurt, and had been fed 6 years of Nazi education, emphasizing sacrifice, duty, and inevitable victory. The letter mentions his bunk, Barely wide enough for my shoulders, but comfortable enough. And the food. Better than I expected, plenty of sausage and black bread. Normal concerns of a young man away from home for the first time. The second patrol letter, dated November 28, 1942, marks the beginning of disillusionment. U-546 had been depth charged near Gibraltar for approximately 6 hours. Bergen doesn't describe the tactical situation. His letter avoids anything that might be considered operational security, but the psychological impact bleeds through. We were beneath the water for what felt like days, though the officers said it was only hours. The hull screamed. I thought the steel would tear. Water came through the rivets, not flooding but seeping, and we could not stop it. Every man was silent, waiting. If that is courage, Mama, then I have none left. The shift in tone is stark, from pride to terror in 3 months. The letter also mentions that one crew member, a machinist named Rolf, whose surname Bergen doesn't provide, has been having nightmares and wakes screaming. No context, no elaboration, just that detail, dropped in as if it were unremarkable. May 1943, after the third patrol, Bergen witnessed U-209 destroyed by a British destroyer about 200 meters from U-546 during a convoy attack. His letter from June 4th describes pulling 2 survivors from the water. Both died of injuries before they could be brought aboard. One was 19 years old, Mama, younger than me. His back was broken from the explosion. He knew he was dying. He asked me to write to his mother in Hamburg. I took his identification tag, but I do not know if I can write that letter. What do I say? That he drowned in the Atlantic for nothing? That we are all drowning? The letter continues with something that sounds like survivor's guilt. I keep thinking, that will be me. Next week, next month, but soon. We do not talk about it on the boat, but every man knows. The war diary counts our victories. Ships sunk, tonnage destroyed. But I count the boats that do not return. More boats stay gone than come home. January 1944, shore leave in Brest. This letter is shorter and darker. Bergen mentions that 2 men from his boat committed suicide during the leave period. One shot himself in the barracks, another overdosed on morphine obtained from the medical station. The commanders do not talk about it, he writes. We are ordered to attend a funeral with full honors, as if they died heroically. But everyone knows. We are not heroes anymore. We are ghosts waiting for our turn to vanish. He also notes increasing alcohol abuse among the crew. Half the men are drunk every night we are in port. The officers pretend not to notice. What else is there? We go to sea knowing we will probably die, so we drink when we can still feel something. The censors apparently missed this letter, or by early 1944, morale reports were so universally grim that one more depressed sailor didn't warrant investigation. The March 1945 letter is brief and carries a tone of resignation that I find almost unbearable to read. U-546 had been ordered to deploy with no specific mission, just proceed to grid square such and such and await instructions. Bergen writes, they have no plan. They send us to sea because keeping U-boats in port is admitting defeat. But everyone knows Germany is collapsing. The question is whether we will survive long enough to surrender or whether we will die for a war that is already lost. I do not expect to survive this patrol, Mama. I am not brave, and I am not afraid anymore. I am simply tired. He asks her to keep his letters, so that someday someone might understand what this was like. Then he signs off, your son, who loves you and wishes he had been a carpenter like Papa wanted. The final letter, April 10th, was found in Bergen's bunk after U-546 was sunk, and the wreck was later located during a Cold War-era sonar survey. Salvage divers recovered personal effects in the 1980s as part of a German naval historical preservation project. The letter was in a waterproof pouch, apparently prepared for mailing but never sent. It's 3 paragraphs. The first describes the boat's mechanical condition. U-546 is falling apart. The diesel engine leaks oil, the batteries barely hold charge, and the hull has stress cracks from too many depth charge attacks. We should be in dry dock for 6 months of repairs. Instead, we are deploying tomorrow. The second paragraph is a goodbye. If this letter reaches you, I am dead. Please do not believe whatever the government tells you about how I died. There is no glory here, only cold water and darkness. The final paragraph is a single sentence. I wish I had been brave enough to refuse. When I map Bergen's psychological trajectory across these 6 letters, I see a case study in institutional betrayal. He enlisted believing the propaganda, that U-boats were invincible, that victory was certain, that sacrifice was meaningful. Each patrol eroded that belief until nothing remained except fatalistic endurance. And the institution offered no acknowledgement of this collapse, no mechanism for processing the trauma, no exit except death or desertion. The letters never mention ideology, no references to Hitler, the Nazi Party, or the supposed righteousness of Germany's war aims. By the end, Bergen wasn't fighting for anything. He was simply trapped in a machine that consumed men and called it duty. The statistical context makes his letters even more tragic. U-boat crew survival rates by year. 1940 through 42, approximately 64% survived the war. 1943, 51%. 1944, 38%. 1945, 24%. Bergen deployed in April 1945, when being assigned to a U-boat was statistically a death sentence. 3 out of 4 men wouldn't come home. He knew this. The entire crew knew this. Yet they still boarded U-546 and sailed, because the alternative, refusing orders, meant court-martial and execution. They chose probable death at sea over certain death by firing squad. There's a chaplain's report in the Bundesarchiv, dated November 1944, that provides institutional context for what Bergen was experiencing individually. The report, filed by a Protestant Navy chaplain assigned to the U-boat base at Kiel, notes a massive increase in requests for emergency baptisms from crew members preparing to deploy. Men who had been atheists or non-practicing their entire lives, suddenly seeking religious rites before patrol. The chaplain interpreted this as a spiritual awakening in the face of mortality. But his private notes, discovered in his personal papers after his death in the 1980s, tell a different story. These men are not finding God. They are preparing to die. The baptisms are a ritual of farewell, a final gesture toward meaning in what they know is meaningless. I perform the sacraments because they ask, but I am complicit in a lie. There is no glory in what they are being sent to do. There is only waste. BDU's own medical reports from 1944 and early 45, now declassified, document what they clinically called operational fatigue syndrome, what we would today recognize as combat PTSD. Symptoms included insomnia, hypervigilance, dissociation, survivor's guilt, suicidal ideation, and what one psychiatrist described as profound demoralization, inconsistent with continued military effectiveness. The recommended treatment was shore leave and reassignment to non-combat roles. The actual treatment was a week of rest, and then deployment on the next patrol, because there weren't enough trained crew to rotate men out of combat. The system was eating its own personnel, and the leadership knew it. And nothing changed because changing it would require admitting the campaign was lost. Reading Bergen's letters in sequence, I realized the Battle of the Atlantic was lost in the minds of men like him, long before it was lost on the ocean. By 1945, maybe earlier, the U-boat force was a zombie, still moving, still going through the motions of combat, but psychologically dead. The crews weren't fighting for victory. They were enduring until the inevitable end, whether that came as surrender or death. Bergen's final letter captures this with awful clarity. The knowledge that deployment was pointless, that the war was lost, that he would probably die, and that he had no choice but to board the boat anyway. Its institutional momentum detached from purpose, men following orders because the machinery of command still functioned, even though the strategic rationale had collapsed. U-546's patrol lasted 14 days. The boat was detected by American destroyer escorts on April 24th while attempting to attack convoy HX-348. USS Flaherty and USS Chatelaine prosecuted a coordinated depth charge attack that lasted approximately 3 hours. At some point during that attack, U-546's pressure hull failed. Whether from direct hit or accumulated structural damage is unknown. The boat sank in roughly 3,000 meters of water. No distress signals were transmitted. No survivors reached the surface. 43 men, including Klaus Bergen, died together in the dark. His mother received official notification on June 2, 1945, 3 weeks after Germany's surrender. The notice said he had fallen in action for Führer and fatherland. She kept his letters in a wooden box for the rest of her life. When she died in 1978, the letters were donated to a military archive. That's how they survived to be published. That's how we know Bergen's voice. But it doesn't make his death mean anything. He knew it was meaningless. He said so, and he died anyway. Chapter 14. The Type 21 That Never Was. The 19th of November, 1944, and at the Blohm und Voss shipyard in Hamburg, a Type 21 submarine, hull number U-2511, sat three-quarters complete on the slipway, surrounded by rubble from the previous night's RAF bombing raid. Konteradmiral Eberhard Gott, Chief of Operations for the U-Boat Command, stood in the cold drizzle, reviewing a damage assessment report that cataloged 17 direct hits on shipyard facilities, 3 assembly halls destroyed, and an estimated 6-week delay in completing U-2511 and 4 other boats in various stages of construction. Gott's diary entry from that evening, preserved in German naval archives, captures his frustration. This boat could sink 10 merchant ships per patrol if we could finish it, but we may never finish it. The Allies bomb us faster than we can build, and even when construction succeeds, quality control fails. We are racing against time we do not have. The Type 21 represented Germany's last realistic hope of prolonging the Atlantic campaign. It arrived too late, plagued by defects, and sank 0 Allied ships during the war. The Type 21 was designed as a revolution, a submarine optimized for sustained underwater operations rather than surface running. The specifications were impressive: 1,621 tons displacement, capable of 18 knots submerged compared to the Type 7's pathetic 7.6 knots. Battery capacity, allowing 280 nautical miles at 10 knots underwater before needing to recharge. The design incorporated hydraulic torpedo reload systems that could fire all 6 bow tubes, reload, and fire again within 20 minutes, twice the speed of conventional boats. The hull was streamlined for underwater efficiency, with a snorkel system integrated into the design, rather than retrofitted awkwardly. On paper, it was exactly what Dönitz had been requesting since 1943, a submarine that could operate submerged for extended periods, evade air patrols through speed and depth, and prosecute multiple attacks before needing to surface. In reality, it was a disaster of rushed production and collapsing quality control. Design work began in June 1943, approved in principle by Dönitz as a response to Black May's catastrophic losses. The first keel was laid in November 1943. The plan called for modular construction, hull sections prefabricated in different factories, then transported to shipyards for final assembly and welding. This was supposed to accelerate production and distribute work to facilities less vulnerable to bombing. It created instead a nightmare of incompatible components and assembly errors. Hull sections arrived with bolt holes that didn't line up with mating sections. Weld quality varied wildly depending on which subcontractor fabricated the piece. Hydraulic systems leaked because seals were manufactured to slightly different tolerances. The electric motors, built by 3 different suppliers, had inconsistent performance characteristics that made depth control erratic. U-2501, the first Type 21 launched, went to sea for trials in February 1944. The trials report, filed by the testing crew, reads like a catalog of catastrophe. Pressure test at 50 meters. Hull leaked at 14 separate points, requiring immediate surfacing and dockyard repairs. Battery test. Capacity measured at 73% of design specifications, and 3 cells overheated during discharge, filling the boat with chlorine gas and forcing evacuation. Torpedo loading test. Hydraulic system jammed after the second reload, requiring manual intervention that took 40 minutes instead of the designed 5 minutes. Diving plane control. Hydraulic pressure insufficient to operate planes at speeds above 12 knots, making the boat difficult to control during high-speed submerged maneuvering. The trial was deemed a failure. U-2501 returned to Blohm und Voss for an estimated 6 weeks of repairs. The repairs took 3 months. By September 1944, production was supposedly accelerating. 15 Type 21s had been launched, but of those 15, only 3 were operationally ready. The others were stuck in repair cycles, fixing defects that should have been caught during construction. A quality control audit ordered by Speer's Armaments Ministry in October identified the core problem: forced labor. By late 1944, German shipyards were heavily dependent on concentration camp prisoners, foreign conscripted workers, and POWs for assembly work. These workers had neither the training nor the motivation to perform precision welding and hydraulic fitting to the tolerances required for submarine construction. Sabotage was documented in several cases. Workers deliberately cross-threading bolts, miswiring electrical systems, or using incorrect gasket materials. But most defects were simply incompetence, combined with exhaustion. You cannot build high-performance machinery with unskilled, malnourished labor working 12-hour shifts under threat of beating. The British were aware of the Type 21 program through intelligence intercepts and prisoner interrogations. An Admiralty assessment from December 1944, drafted after analyzing reports from captured U-boat officers, concluded, if deployed in numbers, this submarine type could restore Germany's Atlantic interdiction capability. Speed and endurance characteristics exceed our current anti-submarine countermeasures. Estimated threat level, severe if operational by spring 1945. Recommended response, prioritize bombing of identified production facilities. The RAF accordingly targeted Blum und Voss, Deutsche Werk in Kiel, and AG Weser in Bremen, with sustained raids throughout early 1945. The bombing was effective. Production rates peaked at 8 boats commissioned per month in March 1945, far below the planned 20 boats per month needed to field a numerically significant force. Only 2 Type 21s completed combat patrols before the war ended, U-2511 and U-3008. U-2511, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Adalbert Schnee, departed Bergen on April 30th, 1945, the same day Hitler committed suicide, for a patrol in the North Atlantic. Schnee's orders were deliberately vague. Proceed to the convoy lanes, demonstrate the boat's capabilities, engage targets of opportunity. The patrol lasted 5 days. On May 4th, Schnee detected the British cruiser HMS Norfolk and conducted a practice attack, lining up a firing solution, tracking the target through the periscope, calculating torpedo spread, but did not fire because ceasefire orders had been transmitted from Dönitz's headquarters the previous day. Schnee's patrol report, filed after he surrendered the boat to Allied forces on May 14th, describes the encounter almost wistfully. I had a perfect firing solution. Range 800 meters, target speed 16 knots, angle on bow 40 degrees. 3 torpedoes would have achieved hits with 95% probability, but the war had ended. I secured the firing solution and withdrew. Post-war interrogators were skeptical of Schnee's account. He claimed he spared Norfolk as an act of restraint after receiving ceasefire orders. But BDU war diary entries suggest the ceasefire order wasn't transmitted until after Schnee's encounter, meaning he either acted on his own initiative, unlikely given his record as a committed officer, or the timeline in his report was adjusted to avoid implications of disobeying direct orders. His own memoir, published in the 1960s, muddies the waters further by suggesting he knew Germany had surrendered and chose not to fire as a personal moral decision. The truth is probably simpler. Schnee received confusing, contradictory orders during the final chaotic days of the war and chose the path that didn't result in additional deaths. Regardless, U-2511 sank no Allied ships during its operational service. U-3008 completed 1 patrol in early May 1945, also without engaging targets. The boat's commander, Oberleutnant Helmut Mansek, reported mechanical problems throughout the voyage, battery performance degrading, hydraulic leaks in the torpedo room, radar detector malfunctioning, and spent most of the patrol submerged, avoiding both Allied patrols and the risk of equipment failure, forcing an embarrassing surface breakdown. The patrol was logged as uneventful. Mansek surrendered U-3008 to British forces on May 10th. The final tally, 118 Type 21s commissioned, 0 Allied ships sunk. The theoretical capability was extraordinary. Post-war, the Americans and Soviets both captured Type 21s and subjected them to exhaustive testing. The U.S. Navy trials concluded that the design was sound, and the performance met or exceeded German specifications, once all the defects were repaired with proper American materials and skilled labor. The Soviets reverse-engineered the design and built their Whiskey-class submarines based heavily on Type 21 hull and propulsion systems. The Americans used it as the basis for the Tang-class boats. In other words, the Type 21 worked, but it required an industrial infrastructure and quality control system that Germany no longer possessed by the time production began. What strikes me about the Type 21 is the counterfactual that haunts it. If Germany had prioritized this design in 1941 or early 42, instead of continuing to build Type 7s, if production had started before Allied bombing degraded shipyard capacity, if quality control had been maintained, the Atlantic campaign might have extended into 1946 or beyond. The boat's submerged speed alone would have forced wholesale revision of Allied convoy tactics. Escorts couldn't catch a Type 21 at 18 knots underwater. Aircraft couldn't force it to surface if it never needed to surface. The advantages were real. But by the time the first boats reached operational status, Germany's strategic position was hopeless. The Atlantic was saturated with Allied air power. Convoy escorts numbered in the hundreds, and production of merchant ships exceeded losses by an order of magnitude. The Type 21 was a solution to problems that mattered in 1942, but were irrelevant in 1945. Dönitz never publicly acknowledged that the Type 21 program failed, though his diary entries from April and May 1945 show awareness that the boats wouldn't influence the war's outcome. On April 20th, he wrote, "The Type 21s represent the future of submarine warfare. Had they entered service in adequate numbers 18 months ago, the campaign might have been sustained. But we do not have 18 months. We have weeks, perhaps days. The boats will serve as a legacy, demonstrating what was possible, but they will not save us." That assessment was accurate. The Type 21 was a blueprint for the future, adopted by navies worldwide in the post-war era. But it was Germany's past, a technology developed too late, produced too poorly, and deployed into a strategic situation where even perfect execution couldn't have mattered. The ocean had already swallowed the Third Reich. The Type 21 merely sank with it, beautifully designed and utterly irrelevant. Chapter 15. The Admiral's Delusion. The 18th of February 1945, and in the Reich Chancellery bunker in Berlin, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz sat across from Adolf Hitler in a conference room that smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke. The meeting had been called to discuss naval operations, though by this point in the war, operations was a generous term for what remained of Germany's military capacity. Stenographer Heinrich Heim, responsible for recording minutes of OKW conferences, sat in the corner, taking notes that would later be partially published under the title Hitler's Table Talk. The exchange that followed reads like theater of the absurd. Two men discussing submarine campaigns, while the Soviet army advanced within 50 miles of Berlin, and American bombers reduced German cities to rubble. Hitler asked, "Can the U-boats still interdict Allied supply lines?" Dönitz replied, "Mein Führer, we will sink ships until the last torpedo is fired." Then Albert Speer, the armaments minister, interrupted with a dose of reality. "But we have no torpedoes. The factories are destroyed." The context makes Dönitz's response even more delusional. By February 1945, Germany's torpedo production facilities at Eckernförde, Friedrichsort, and the factories in Prussia had been largely obliterated by Allied bombing. Monthly torpedo production had fallen from approximately 1,200 units in mid-1943 to fewer than 200 in early 1945. Most U-boats departing on patrol carried partial loadings, 14 torpedoes instead of the standard 23 for a Type 7, because there weren't enough weapons to fully arm the fleet. Yet Dönitz was promising Hitler continued offensive operations, as if industrial capacity still existed. Either he was deliberately lying to the Führer, or he had detached so completely from material reality that he believed his own rhetoric. A memo from Dönitz to Hitler, dated January 10, 1945, provides insight into his strategic thinking, or lack thereof. The document, preserved in German military archives, argues U-boat operations tie down 3,000 Allied escort vessels and thousands of aircraft in defensive duties. Even if we sink no ships, the enemy must deploy enormous resources to counter our presence. This fleet in being effect justifies continued operations. This is the same discredited logic that the German High Seas Fleet used in World War I. The idea that merely existing forces the enemy to expend resources, and therefore your fleet has value, even if it never fights. The flaw is that the resources Germany spent maintaining U-boat operations far exceeded the cost to the Allies of defending against them. training crews, building boats, supplying bases, repairing damage. All of this consumed German steel, fuel, and labor that could have been used for literally anything else. And the Allies, with overwhelming industrial capacity, could easily afford the defensive expenditures. The equation didn't balance. The February 18th conference devolved into an argument about numbers. Hitler asked for tonnage sunk in January. Dönitz replied, 57,000 tons, mein Führer. Speer immediately challenged this. The intelligence summaries I've seen show Allied losses of 23,000 tons. Where is this discrepancy? Dönitz claimed the difference was due to delayed confirmation of sinkings, that U-boats had reported attacks that hadn't yet been verified by intelligence. But post-war analysis using Allied loss records confirms Speer was right. Actual verified losses in January 1945 were approximately 23,400 tons. Dönitz had inflated the figure by 143%. When interrogated about this after the war, he claimed intelligence errors, and that he had relied on reports from U-boat commanders who overestimated the size of ships they'd hit. Possibly true. Also possibly a deliberate inflation to justify continued operations to a Führer who demanded results. On March 8, 1945, Dönitz ordered U-boats to attack Allied supply convoys supporting the Rhine crossing, the final major Allied offensive into Germany's heartland. 12 boats deployed from Norwegian bases into the North Sea and English Channel. Within 2 weeks, 11 had been sunk. The only survivor, U-2321, aborted patrol with mechanical failures and returned to Bergen without engaging any targets. 0 Allied ships hit. 11 U-boats destroyed, representing approximately 480 crew killed. Contra-Admiral Gott's diary entry from March 28 is scathing. This is murder. We are sending boys to die for radio propaganda. The Führer wants to hear that the U-boats are still fighting, so Dönitz sends them to sea, knowing they will not return. It is criminal. Gott's use of the word murder is significant. By March 1945, any competent naval officer understood that U-boat operations had 0 strategic value. The Allies were landing millions of tons of supplies directly into French and Belgian ports captured during the Normandy campaign. Interdicting convoys crossing the Atlantic couldn't possibly affect the immediate military situation. Yet Dönitz continued ordering patrols, and crews continued dying, because stopping would require admitting the campaign had failed. The institutional machinery kept functioning through pure inertia, grinding up men for no purpose except maintaining the appearance of resistance. April 1st, 1945, and the operational statistics paint a picture of total collapse. BDU records show 463 U-boats, on paper, meaning commissioned and theoretically part of the fleet. Of these, 372 were in port with no fuel, no torpedoes, or no crew. 60 were training boats unsuitable for combat. 31 were operationally ready and either at sea or preparing to deploy. The U-boat threat, that Allied intelligence still tracked nervously, was largely a fiction. Most of the boats couldn't leave port even if ordered to, and the ones that did deploy operated with skeleton crews, partial ammunition loads, and equipment so worn that mechanical failures were routine. Then, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. Dönitz, named as Hitler's successor in the Führer's last will and testament, became head of state for what was called the Flensburg government, a rump administration that controlled shrinking pockets of northern Germany for 8 days. One of Dönitz's first acts as acting Führer was to order cessation of U-boat combat operations. The signal, transmitted on May 1st, read, "All U-boats cease offensive operations immediately. Boats at sea are to surface, transmit position, and await further instructions. Do not engage Allied forces except in self-defense." It was capitulation without using the word. The war officially ended 1 week later, on May 8th. Post-war, Dönitz was arrested by British forces on May 23rd and eventually tried at Nuremberg for war crimes. The prosecution argued that he had continued unrestricted submarine warfare long after it ceased to have military justification, prolonging suffering without strategic benefit. The specific charge was waging aggressive war and crimes against peace. Dönitz defended himself by arguing that submarine operations remained militarily justified until Germany's surrender, that Allied forces also conducted unrestricted warfare, and that he was following orders and executing his duty as a naval officer. The tribunal was unconvinced. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, serving the full term in Spandau prison, and being released in 1956. The interrogation transcripts from Dönitz's post-war debriefings reveal a man who either genuinely couldn't comprehend the futility of the campaign's final phase, or who maintained a careful facade of professional competence to avoid harsher punishment. When asked why he continued operations in 1945, despite catastrophic loss rates and negligible results, he replied, "It was my duty. A soldier does not question orders. The strategic situation was dire, but one continues to resist until formally ordered to cease." When pressed on whether he recognized that crew survival rates had fallen below 25%, making U-boat assignment effectively a death sentence, he said, "War involves sacrifice." The men knew the risks and served bravely. No acknowledgement that sending men on suicide missions for propaganda value might constitute criminal negligence. Reading these transcripts, I'm struck by how Dönitz's language shifts between operational discussions and abstract rhetoric. When interrogators asked specific questions, how many torpedoes did you have in February? What were the actual sinking figures? He gave evasive or inaccurate answers. When they asked broader questions about strategy or objectives, he retreated into vague statements about duty, resistance, and military necessity. It's the discourse of a man who spent the final 2 years of the war managing optics rather than operations, crafting narratives for Hitler rather than confronting reality. By 1945, Dönitz wasn't commanding a naval force. He was performing the role of U-boat commander for an audience of Nazi leadership who wanted to hear that Germany was still fighting. The question of whether this was cynical manipulation or genuine delusion is unresolvable from the available evidence. Dönitz's private diaries show moments of doubt and frustration, but also consistent commitment to the campaign's continuation. Perhaps he convinced himself that resistance, however futile, was morally necessary. Perhaps he understood perfectly well that it was pointless, but couldn't psychologically afford to admit it. Either way, the result was the same. Hundreds of men sent to sea in the final months of the war, knowing they would probably die, for a strategic objective that no longer existed. The arithmetic had spoken years earlier, but Dönitz kept calculating, kept sending the boats out, kept claiming that victory, or at least stalemate, remained possible. The ocean kept drowning men, the ledgers kept accumulating bodies, and when it finally ended, Dönitz stood in a courtroom and insisted he had simply been doing his job. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps that's the most disturbing possibility, that he genuinely saw no alternative, no moment when he could have said, "Enough," and stopped the machine. So it ran until it destroyed itself, and Dönitz called it duty. Chapter 16, The Scuttling. The 4th of May, 1945, and the war in Europe had 3 days remaining, though most participants didn't yet know it. In Flensburg, in northern Germany near the Danish border, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, now acting as Germany's head of state following Hitler's suicide, drafted an order that would end the U-boat war, not with combat, but with self-destruction. The signal, designated Order 231 in BDU's operational logs, was transmitted to all U-boats at sea and in port. All U-boats are to be scuttled immediately. Destroy all codes, cipher equipment, and classified documents. Do not surrender boats to enemy forces. The order reflected both military pragmatism and a final assertion of control. If Germany couldn't win, it would at least deny the Allies the satisfaction of capturing the submarine fleet intact. But the practical effect was anticlimactic. Most boats were already immobilized in port, out of fuel, ammunition, and crew. Scuttling them was formalizing what had already occurred through material exhaustion. U-181, one of the highest-scoring U-boats of the war, with 29 ships sunk totaling 187,000 tons across 8 patrols, sat moored at Kiel on May 5th when its commander, Lieutenant zur See Wolfgang Luth, received the scuttle order. Luth had been one of the U-boat service's most decorated officers, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, one of only 7 naval officers to receive that level of recognition. His war diary entries from early May show a man struggling with the cognitive dissonance between his professional identity as a warrior and the reality that the war was over and lost. May 3rd entry. Orders from Flensburg suggest imminent ceasefire. Boat is operationally ready, but there is nowhere to go. The enemy controls all sea approaches. We wait. May 5th entry, the final one. Received scuttle order 0830 hours. Opened sea valves at 0845. Boat sank in 12 minutes. Crew evacuated to shore. This is the end. The technical procedure for scuttling a U-boat was straightforward, but emotionally brutal for crews who had lived inside these machines for years. The sea valves, large intake ports normally used for ballast and trim adjustment, would be manually opened in the engine room, torpedo rooms, and auxiliary machinery spaces. Seawater would flood in at a rate of several tons per minute. The boat would settle slowly at first, then rapidly, as water breached watertight compartments. Sinking time for a Type 7 ranged from 8 to 15 minutes, depending on how many valves were opened, and whether explosive charges were used to accelerate the process. Some crews removed identifying plates, flags, or instruments as souvenirs, final pieces of identity before the boat disappeared. Luth's crew took the boat's Kriegsmarine ensign and the brass nameplate from the conning tower. Then they walked away and watched U-181 slip beneath the surface of Kiel Harbor. The mass scuttling occurred across northern Germany over roughly 48 hours, May 5th through 7th. Kiel, Flensburg, Hamburg, Wilhelmshaven. Every U-boat base witnessed the same scene. Submarines lined up in shallow harbors or coastal waters, sea valves opened, boats settling slowly into the mud. British occupation troops arriving in the days following the surrender found harbors choked with conning towers and periscopes protruding above the waterline, like gravestones in a flooded cemetery. An estimated 219 U-boats were scuttled by their crews during this period. Some sank cleanly in deep water and remain on the seafloor. Others settled in shallow harbors and were later salvaged for scrap. A few, scuttled in channels or navigation routes, had to be demolished with explosives to clear shipping lanes. The emotional responses varied. Some crews treated the scuttling as a ritual, a final act of defiance. We will destroy what we cannot keep. Others were simply exhausted and relieved that the dying had stopped. British reports from occupation forces describe finding empty vodka bottles scattered on the docks near scuttled submarines, suggesting crews got drunk before sinking their boats. One report from Flensburg notes, German sailors appeared subdued, but not hostile. Several were observed weeping as their boats went under. Others showed no visible emotion. The overall atmosphere was one of profound fatigue. Not all U-boats were scuttled. Dönitz's order included a provision. Boats at sea are to surface, transmit position, and proceed to designated Allied ports for surrender. 156 submarines complied, surfacing and sailing under black flags, the internationally recognized signal of surrender, to ports in Britain, Norway, and Canada. The sight of U-boats arriving in enemy harbors, their crews lined up on deck in dress uniforms, was surreal. These machines had killed tens of thousands of Allied sailors, sunk millions of tons of shipping, and now they motored docilely into Portsmouth or Liverpool, with German officers saluting British port authorities. It was the bureaucratic face of defeat, formal, orderly, empty of emotion. Two boats famously refused to surrender, U-977 and U-530. Both departed Norway in early May, ostensibly following ceasefire orders, but instead sailed to Argentina, arriving in August 1945, months after the war had ended. The commanders, Kapitän Lieutenant Heinz Schaefer of U-977 and Oberleutnant Otto Vermuth of U-530, later claimed they fled to South America to avoid surrendering to Soviet forces, Argentina being a neutral country with a history of sheltering Axis personnel. Argentine authorities interned the crews and eventually repatriated them to Germany. The boats were scrapped. Both commanders published memoirs justifying their actions as principled refusal to surrender to communism rather than simple desertion, though historians generally interpret the flights as panic-driven escapes by men who feared post-war retribution. The Allies didn't want most of the surrendered U-boats. A few, like U-2511 and U-3008, the operational Type 21s, were kept for technical evaluation. The rest were deemed surplus. In November 1945, the British initiated Operation Deadlight, mass disposal of captured German submarines. 116 U-boats were towed to deep water northwest of Scotland, to a location called the North Channel between Scotland and Northern Ireland, and systematically sunk using gunfire, torpedoes, or scuttling charges. The operation took weeks. Each boat was positioned over deep water, usually around 1,000 meters depth, and destroyed. Some sank quickly. Others proved stubbornly resilient, absorbing multiple hits before finally going down. The goal was to ensure they could never be salvaged or reused. The ocean became their final resting place. The total accounting is grim. At war's end, Germany had commissioned approximately 1,162 U-boats since 1935. Of these, 783 were lost during the war, sunk in combat, scuttled to avoid capture, or destroyed in port by bombing. 219 were scuttled in May 1945 by German crews. 156 surrendered intact. 4 were retained by Allies for study or museum preservation. The rest, approximately 116, were destroyed in Operation Deadlight. The Arithmetic, 375 U-boats scuttled or destroyed by Germany itself in the final months of the war. More tonnage than Germany sank in the entire year of 1944. The final irony, the U-boat force's greatest destruction was self-inflicted. When I examine photographs from the scuttling period, I'm struck by the absence of drama. These aren't action photos, no explosions, no combat, no heroic imagery, just submarines settling quietly into harbor water, conning towers disappearing beneath the surface, leaving oil slicks and air bubbles. It looks mundane, almost boring. But that mundanity is the point. This is what defeat looks like at the operational level. Not a climactic battle, but a bureaucratic process of disposal. Forms filled out, orders transmitted, valves opened, equipment destroyed, crews dismissed, the machinery of war dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing functional remains. Luth, the decorated commander who scuttled U-181, survived the war by exactly 9 days. On May 14th, he was shot and killed by a German sentry at a naval base near Flensburg, under circumstances that remain disputed. The official report said the sentry mistook Luth for an intruder during a nighttime patrol and fired before identifying him. Unofficial accounts suggest the shooting might have been deliberate, that Luth's reputation as a fanatical Nazi made him a target for soldiers who wanted to distance themselves from the regime now that the war was lost. The truth is unknowable, but the timing is notable. He scuttled his boat, ending his career as a U-boat commander, and died within days, as if the identity and the man were so intertwined that one couldn't survive without the other. The scuttling was Germany's admission that the Atlantic campaign had always been unwinnable. By destroying the U-boat fleet, Dönitz effectively acknowledged what he'd never stated publicly during the war. The boats couldn't defeat Britain, couldn't interdict Allied supplies at strategic scale, couldn't alter the war's outcome. Better to sink them than surrender them, because surrender would require explicitly admitting they had failed. Scuttling preserved a final shred of control. We choose to end this, on our terms, even if the choice is destruction. It was gesture without substance, symbolism without strategy. The boats sank, the war ended, and the ocean, which had swallowed so many men and ships over 6 years, took the submarines too. They rest there still, hundreds of them scattered across the Atlantic floor, monuments to a campaign that was mathematically doomed from the beginning, but ground on for 6 years because no one with the power to stop it could admit the arithmetic didn't work. Chapter 17, The Ledger. The 8th of May, 1945, and the war in Europe was over. In offices across London, Washington, and Berlin, bureaucrats began the work of accounting, compiling final statistics, cross-referencing loss reports, calculating the arithmetic of 6 years of industrial slaughter. The numbers would be disputed for decades, revised as new evidence emerged, corrected as wartime exaggerations were identified and stripped away. But by the early 1950s, a consensus emerged around certain figures. 2,603 Allied merchant ships sunk, totaling approximately 13.5 million gross registered tons. 783 U-boats destroyed. 175 Allied warships sunk. German casualties, approximately 30,000 submariners killed. Roughly 70% of all men who served in U-boats during the war. Allied casualties, approximately 36,000 merchant sailors dead, plus naval personnel losses across all theaters, approximately 20,000 of which can be attributed to Atlantic operations. The cost in treasure. Germany spent an estimated 11 billion Reichsmarks on the U-boat campaign. The Allies spent incalculably more on convoy escorts, aircraft, shipbuilding, and defensive infrastructure, but they won. The numbers say so. I want to start with the tonnage mirage because it reveals how the entire campaign was built on systematically inflated expectations. German claims for total Allied shipping sunk, 1939 through 45, approximately 15.3 million tons. Verified Allied losses per post-war reconciliation of Lloyd's Register and Admiralty records, 13.5 million tons, an inflation of roughly 13%. By the standards of wartime overclaiming, where combatants routinely doubled or tripled actual results, 13% is almost honest. But it's still 1.8 million phantom tons, ships that German commanders thought they'd sunk but were actually damaged and salvaged, or misidentified, or double-counted when multiple boats claimed the same kill. Dönitz based strategic planning on those inflated numbers, which meant his assessment of campaign effectiveness was wrong from the beginning. But even accepting the accurate figure, 13.5 million tons sunk, the number becomes less impressive when placed in context. Britain's total imports in 1941, before American entry into the war, approximately 38 million tons. Germany sank roughly 3.7 million tons that year, the highest annual total of the war. That's approximately 9.7% of British imports interdicted. Painful, certainly. Rationing was severe. Specific shortages created real hardship. But 9.7% interdiction is nowhere near the 50% or greater needed to force economic collapse or starvation. Britain cut civilian consumption, rationed fuel, reduced non-essential imports, and survived. In 1942, with U-boats at peak effectiveness, Germany sank 6.2 million tons globally. British imports that year, approximately 34 million tons, 18% interdiction. Still survivable. The replacement equation tells the real story. From 1939 through 1945, the Allies launched approximately 42 million deadweight tons of new merchant shipping. Liberty ships, victory ships, tankers, freighters, everything. Even accounting for 13.5 million tons lost, the net gain was plus 28.5 million tons. Germany didn't just fail to sink faster than the Allies could replace. They fell behind by a ratio of approximately 3-1. The Allied merchant fleet at war's end was larger than it had been in 1939, despite 6 years of sustained U-boat attacks. That's the fundamental arithmetic failure of the entire campaign. The human cost is harder to calculate, but more morally significant. 28,000 U-boat crew deaths out of approximately 40,000 who served equals a 70% fatality rate. For comparison, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had roughly 50% fatality rates. German infantry on the Eastern Front, depending on time period and unit, ranged from 30 to 60%. The U-boat service had the highest loss rate of any German military branch. Men who volunteered for submarines in 1939, expecting an elite, technologically advanced service with reasonable survival odds, found themselves in a death lottery by 1943. Most didn't survive. Allied merchant sailor losses, 36,000 dead, represent a similar scale of suffering, but from a larger pool. Estimates suggest approximately 250,000 men served in the Allied merchant marines during the war, meaning roughly 14% died. Lower than U-boat rates, but still catastrophic compared to civilian occupations, or even many combat roles. And merchant sailors weren't military personnel. They were civilians, often older men, or those rejected for military service, working commercial vessels for wages. They had minimal combat training, inadequate defensive armament, and no expectation when they signed on to haul cargo in 1939 that they'd be sailing through war zones 6 years later. The strategic void is what fascinates me most. Even at peak effectiveness in 1942, U-boats sank 6.2 million tons of Allied shipping. But British minimum import requirements, according to Ministry of Food calculations preserved in National Archives records, were approximately 26 million tons per year to sustain basic military operations and prevent civilian starvation. The U-boats achieved 24% of that interdiction target in their best year. 24%. Not 50%. Not 75%. Less than 1/4 of what was needed to force Britain to capitulate or negotiate. And that was with roughly 140 operational U-boats, the highest strength Germany achieved. To reach 50% interdiction, 13 million tons per year, would have required approximately 600 boats operational simultaneously, assuming similar effectiveness rates. Germany never had more than 160 operational at any point. The counterfactual question haunts this analysis. If Germany had built 300 U-boats before the war began, as Dönitz originally requested, could they have won the Atlantic campaign? I believe the answer is no, though with caveats. 300 boats in September 1939 would have overwhelmed British convoy defenses, which were essentially non-existent in the war's first year. Monthly sinking rates might have reached 750,000 tons, or higher, during the happy time of mid-1940. Sustained at that level, British imports would have fallen below critical thresholds by late 1940 or early 1941. Food rationing would have approached starvation levels. Industrial production would have collapsed from lack of raw materials. The outcome becomes plausible, not certain, but plausible, that Britain negotiates a ceasefire or conditional surrender. But this assumes the Allies don't adapt, which is historically naive. Faced with catastrophic losses, Britain would have accelerated convoy escort production, deployed aircraft sooner, possibly transferred destroyers from the Mediterranean or Far East earlier. America, even while neutral, was supplying Britain and had strong incentives to prevent British collapse. Lend-Lease might have started in 1940 instead of 1941. The production gap would have asserted itself eventually. Perhaps Germany wins an extra year or 18 months of favorable exchange ratios, but by 1942 or 43, Allied countermeasures, radar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, Liberty ship production would have neutralized the numerical advantage just as they did historically. The window would have been wider, but it still would have closed. The reality is that the Battle of the Atlantic was decided by industrial capacity, not tactics or courage or technological innovation. Germany spent 11 billion Reichsmarks building and operating roughly 1,162 submarines over 6 years. The Allies spent more. Exact figures are disputed, but estimates run to $15 to $20 billion USD equivalent on convoy escorts, patrol aircraft, merchant ship construction, port defenses, and supporting infrastructure. But the Allies could afford it. Their combined industrial output in steel, shipbuilding, aircraft production, and electronics manufacturing exceeded Germany's by ratios ranging from 5-to-1 to 10-to-1, depending on the sector. You cannot win a production war when you're outproduced by an order of magnitude. It doesn't matter how good your tactics are. When I plot the monthly tonnage sunk from September 1939 through May 1945 on a graph, the shape is revealing. It rises gradually through 1940 and 41, spikes dramatically in late 1942 and early 1943, then collapses after May 1943 and never recovers. The curve looks like a bell curve centered on Black May. Everything before is buildup, everything after is decline. The campaign had roughly 45 months of increasing effectiveness and 24 months of terminal collapse. And even during the effective period, monthly sinking rates only twice exceeded the 750,000-ton target Dönitz had identified as necessary for strategic victory. 2 months out of 72. That's not a viable campaign. That's noise in a larger pattern of failure. Post-war interrogations of captured U-boat officers are illuminating because they reveal when German commanders themselves realized the campaign was lost. The question, "When did you know you'd lost?" produced consistent answers. May 1943. A few said late 1942, after witnessing the scale of American ship production. Only one, Korvettenkapitan Reinhard Suren, a highly decorated commander who survived the war, said September 1, 1939. His explanation, recorded in interrogation transcripts held at the U.S. National Archives. "We went to war with 57 boats. The BDU staff calculated we needed 300 minimum. Simple mathematics. It was over before it began. Everything after was just dying slowly." That assessment strikes me as historically accurate, even if it's psychologically unbearable. The campaign was doomed from inception because Germany never possessed the industrial resources to build, maintain, and crew a submarine force large enough to achieve strategic effects against an enemy with Britain's import requirements and America's production capacity. All the tactical innovations, wolf packs, acoustic torpedoes, schnorkels, Type 21s, were attempts to overcome a fundamental arithmetic problem that had no tactical solution. You cannot sink ships faster than the enemy builds them, when the enemy builds ships 40 times faster than you build submarines. The mathematics are unambiguous. I believe history is arithmetic with consequences. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost in 1938 when Dönitz failed to secure the 300-boat fleet he knew was necessary. Everything after was momentum toward an inevitable conclusion. The men who died in U-boats, 28,000 of them, died for a campaign that was mathematically impossible from the start. The merchant sailors who drowned, 36,000 of them, died defending a supply line that was never in genuine danger of strategic collapse. Both sides fed men into a machine that ground them up and called it war. The only difference is that one side's arithmetic worked and the other's didn't. The final lesson for our current moment in 2026 is uncomfortably relevant. Industrial capacity is the ultimate strategic weapon. No amount of tactical innovation, U-boats, stealth technology, precision missiles, cyber warfare, can compensate for being outproduced 10-1. Apply this to contemporary strategic competitions. China's shipbuilding capacity is approximately 50% of global output, dwarfing American and European production combined. Semiconductor manufacturing is concentrated in Taiwan and South Korea, creating single points of failure for entire technological ecosystems. Rare earth mineral extraction is dominated by nations that may not remain aligned with Western strategic interests. These are the bottlenecks, the leverage points, the places where wars, if they come, will be won or lost long before the first shot is fired. The Atlantic taught us that wars are won in factories and supply chains. The side that can build more, repair faster, replace losses quicker, and sustain logistics longer wins. Everything else, tactics, bravery, technological sophistication, is commentary. Germany had sophisticated U-boats, skilled commanders, and fanatical determination. They lost because they couldn't build enough of them, couldn't sustain operations at required scale, and faced enemies who could afford to absorb losses and keep fighting. The ocean kept drowning men, the factories kept building ships, and arithmetic, indifferent and precise, decided the outcome. It always does. The ledger is closed. The numbers don't lie. 2,603 merchant ships sunk, 13.5 million tons lost, 64,000 men dead on both sides, 11 billion Reichsmark spent, 6 years of continuous combat, and the strategic result was Allied victory by overwhelming industrial advantage. Germany's U-boats fought bravely and died uselessly in a campaign that never had a mathematical path to success. That's not cynicism, that's just counting. And the numbers, when you count them honestly, tell the story of a war lost before it began. The Atlantic swallowed the evidence. 783 submarines resting on the seafloor, monuments to tactical competence in service of strategic impossibility. They're still there. The ocean doesn't forget, neither should we.